Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. I still can't believe I'm writing this. It feels like something out of a movie, but I swear to you, this is all true. My name is Ethan, and I'm just your average teenager. Nothing special about me. But this one night, I stumbled upon something that changed my life forever. It still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It all started last summer, on a humid July night. My parents had left me home alone while they went to visit my grandma in the hospital. I wanted to go with them, but they said she wasn't doing well and didn't want me to see her like that. So, there I was, stuck at home with nothing to do. Around midnight, I got this restless feeling. I couldn't sleep. I paced around the house and then decided to go out for a walk. We live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever really happens. Or so I thought. I was walking down Hollow Street, the next road over from mine. It's a little darker and quieter than the rest of the neighborhood, with fewer houses and lots of tall, creepy trees. As I turned a corner, I noticed a house that I'd never seen before. That's weird because I've lived in this area my whole life. It wasn't a new build or anything. It looked old, really old. The paint was peeling, and the shutters were falling off. The windows were so dusty you couldn't see inside. I stopped and stared at it for a while. Something about it just didn't feel right. It was like the air around it was heavier, and I felt this cold chill run down my back, even though it was the middle of summer. Against my better judgment, I decided to get a closer look. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just needed something to do. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the sound made my heart race. The grass in the yard was overgrown, reaching up to my knees, and the porch steps groaned under my weight as I climbed them. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. It felt like an invitation, but not a friendly one. I should have turned around right then and there, but instead, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, damp wood and something metallic, like rust or blood. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the cracked windows. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper that was peeling in some places, revealing rotting wood underneath. The floorboards creaked with every step I took. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt alive, like it was watching me. I reached the living room, and that's when I saw it. A photo album sitting on a dusty coffee table. It looked out of place, almost new compared to everything else in the house. I hesitated but eventually picked it up and opened it. The first few pages were filled with black and white photos of a family. A mother, a father, and two kids, a boy and a girl. They looked happy, smiling in every picture. But as I flipped through the album, the photos started to change. The smiles faded. The kids looked scared. In the last photo, they weren't smiling at all. They were crying. And behind them stood a shadowy figure, barely visible but definitely there. That's when I heard it, a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, like whispering, but then it got louder. It sounded like crying. My legs felt like jelly, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know what was going on. I climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The crying grew louder as I reached the top. There were 3 doors in the hallway, all closed. The crying was coming from the last one on the right. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty. No furniture, no people, nothing. But the crying was still there, echoing all around me. I was frozen in place, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The crying stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. And then I heard it, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the room I was in. I panicked and started banging on the door, trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to listen, and that's when I heard it. A low, raspy voice whispering my name. Ethan. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the grass outside the house, staring up at the night sky. The house was gone. I mean it, completely gone. All that was left was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I ran home as fast as I could, my lungs burning, tears streaming down my face. I didn't tell my parents or anyone else about what happened. Who would believe me? A house that disappears? A ghostly voice calling my name? It sounds crazy, even to me. But here's the thing. A few weeks later, I was at the library, trying to distract myself from everything that had happened. I was flipping through some old newspapers when I stumbled upon an article from the 1950s. It was about a family that had lived on Hollow Street, a mother, a father, and 2 kids. They'd all disappeared one night, without a trace. The neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house, but when the police investigated, the house was empty. A few years later, the house mysteriously burned down. I don't know what I saw that night or why the house appeared to me, but I do know one thing. I'm never walking down Hollow Street again, and if you're smart, you won't either. My name is Clara, and I'll never forget what happened that fall when I was 17. It's been years now, but the memory clings to me, cold and heavy, like the mist that rises off Blackthorn Lake in October. If I close my eyes, I can still smell the damp earth and hear the whispers of the wind in the reeds. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. There wasn't much to do, so my friends and I spent most of our time exploring the woods and swimming in Blackthorn Lake. The lake had always had a strange reputation. People said it was haunted, that if you were quiet enough, you could hear the voices of those who had drowned there. My mom used to warn me about going near it after dark, but I never listened. It was just a lake, after all, or so I thought. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon in late October. The trees had shed most of their leaves, and the woods felt bare and exposed. My best friend, Emma, had convinced me to go out exploring with her. She was always the adventurous one, dragging me along on her crazy ideas. That day, she had a particular spot in mind, a little cove on the far side of the lake that we'd never visited before. "Come on, Clara," she said, tugging on my arm. "There's supposed to be an old cabin out there. Maybe we'll find something cool." Reluctantly, I agreed. The hike around the lake was long and uneven, and by the time we reached the cove, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. The water was eerily still, reflecting the fiery orange of the sunset. We found the cabin easily enough. It was more of a shack, really small, rotting, and leaning to one side as if it had given up on standing straight. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were nothing but empty frames. It looked like no one had been there in decades. Emma, being Emma, marched right in, flashlight in hand. I hesitated, but the thought of standing outside alone was even more unnerving, so I followed her. The inside was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. The floor was littered with leaves and broken glass. There was an old wooden table in the corner, covered in strange carvings that looked like symbols or runes. "Check this out," Emma said, shining her flashlight on the table. "What do you think it means?" "I have no idea," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The carvings made me uneasy, like they were watching us. That's when I saw it, a small, silver locket lying on the floor near the table. It looked completely out of place, shiny and clean, as if it had just been polished. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. There was an engraving on the back, MR 1923. "Hey, Emma, look at this," I said, holding it up. "Whoa," she said, taking it from me. "This is old. You think it belonged to someone who lived here?" "Maybe," I said, but something about it didn't feel right. It felt personal, like I shouldn't be touching it. Emma opened the locket, and inside was a tiny black and white photo of a young woman. She looked to be about our age, with soft curls and a serious expression. On the other side of the locket was a lock of hair, faded to a pale gray. "Weird," Emma said, handing it back to me. "You should keep it. It's cool." I wanted to say no, to leave it where I found it, but for some reason, I slipped it into my pocket. As we left the cabin, the sky had turned a deep purple, and the first stars were starting to appear. The walk back around the lake felt longer, the shadows stretching out and swallowing the path. Neither of us spoke much. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. When I got home, I put the locket on my nightstand and tried not to think about it. But that night, I had the most vivid, terrifying dream. I was standing at the edge of Blackthorn Lake, the water black and rippling under a full moon. The young woman from the locket was there, standing in the shallows. Her dress was wet, clinging to her, and her eyes were wide and empty, like she was staring right through me. "Give it back," she whispered, her voice soft but sharp, like the edge of a knife. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was freezing, even though I had my window closed. The locket was still on my nightstand, but it looked different, tarnished, darker, as if it had aged overnight. The next morning, I told Emma about the dream. She just laughed and told me I was being dramatic. "It's just a piece of jewelry, Clara," she said. "You're freaking yourself out." But the dreams didn't stop. Every night, I saw the woman by the lake. She got closer each time, her whispers growing louder, angrier. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to return the locket to the cabin. Emma insisted on coming with me, though I could tell she thought I was being ridiculous. We made our way back to the cove, the air colder and heavier than it had been before. The cabin seemed darker, more decayed, like it had been rotting away for centuries instead of decades. I placed the locket on the table where I'd found it, whispering a shaky apology into the still air. For a moment, everything felt calm. But as we turned to leave, we heard it, a splash from the lake, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on the shore. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my whole body frozen with fear. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, but we couldn't see anyone. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Emma's arm. We bolted out of the cabin and through the woods, not stopping until we reached the main road. By the time we got back to town, my lungs were burning and tears were streaming down my face. We never spoke about what happened that day. Emma refused to acknowledge it, and I tried my best to forget. But strange things kept happening. I would hear whispers in the wind, see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye. And then, a week later, the newspaper ran a story about a body found in Blackthorn Lake. A young woman, her remains perfectly preserved despite being underwater for decades. The article didn't mention her name, but there was a photo. It was her, the woman from the locket. To this day, I don't know what happened at that cabin or why the locket called out to me. But I do know this: Blackthorn Lake isn't just a place. It's a doorway, and sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. My name is Josh, and I used to think stories about haunted highways were just urban legends. Scary tales meant to keep you from picking up strangers or driving late at night. But what happened to me one cold November evening changed everything. It wasn't just a story. It was real. It started on a deserted stretch of Highway 47, a lonely two-lane road cutting through miles of forest. I was driving back to college after a weekend at my parents' house. It was late, close to midnight, and the air was so cold I could see my breath in the car. My heater had been acting up for weeks, and the chilly air made me grip the steering wheel tighter. The road was empty, and the only sound was the hum of my tires against the asphalt. It was the kind of night where the world felt smaller, boxed in by the darkness. I had just passed a faded green sign that read, "Turner Junction, 12 miles, when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. A young woman, probably in her 20s, wearing a thin coat that was way too light for the freezing weather. Her head was down, her hair falling in tangled strands over her face. She was holding something, a small book, maybe. I don't know why I stopped. I've always been cautious, especially at night, but something about her felt wrong, vulnerable, like she needed help. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the passenger side window. "Do you need a ride?" I called out. She didn't answer at first, just stood there, clutching the book. Then she nodded, almost reluctantly, and climbed into the car without saying a word. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I pulled back onto the highway. "Turner Junction. she said softly. Her voice was low and flat, like she was struggling to speak. The smell hit me then, a faint but sharp metallic scent, like rust or old pennies. I glanced at her, but she was staring out the window, her face pale and gaunt. Her hands were gripping the book so tightly that her knuckles were white. "You okay?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She nodded but didn't look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dark trees outside. For the next few miles, we drove in silence. The only sound was the occasional creak of the car as it hit bumps in the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. Her presence made the air in the car feel heavier, colder. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you ever seen it?" "Seen what?" I asked, glancing at her. "The man," she said, her eyes finally meeting mine. They were dark, hollow, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or sorrow. I didn't know how to respond, so I just shook my head. "You will," she said, her voice steady but unnerving. "He always finds you." I laughed nervously, hoping she was just messing with me. "You're not making a lot of sense," I said. She didn't reply. Instead, she opened the book she'd been holding, flipping through its pages. It wasn't a book at all. It was a journal, the kind with a worn leather cover and pages yellowed with age. She stopped on a page and turned it toward me. The words were written in a messy scrawl, smeared in places like someone had been writing in a hurry. "He comes at night. Always the same time. Midnight. Don't stop for him. Don't talk to him. If you do, he'll never let you go." A chill ran down my spine. "Who wrote that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "They did," she said, her tone cryptic. "Who's they?" She didn't answer. Instead, she closed the journal and stared straight ahead, her expression blank. I was starting to regret stopping for her. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't wait to drop her off in Turner Junction and get as far away as possible. But then she did something that made my stomach drop. She pointed to the dashboard clock. It was 11:59. "He's coming," she said, her voice trembling now. "Don't stop, no matter what you see." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the fear in her eyes stopped me. Before I could say anything, the car started to sputter. The engine stalled, and the car coasted to a stop in the middle of the road. "No, no, no," I muttered, turning the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't start. The highway was completely silent, the darkness pressing in around us. The only light came from the pale glow of the dashboard. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. She didn't answer. She was staring out the windshield, her hands clutching the journal so tightly it looked like she might tear it in half. Then I saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked like they belonged in a black and white photo. His face was pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and his eyes were empty. I don't mean they were blank or lifeless. I mean they were literally empty, black, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. He started walking toward us, his movements slow and deliberate. "Don't look at him," the woman whispered. "Don't talk to him. And whatever you do, don't open the door." I locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The man kept coming, his steps echoing in the silence. When he reached the car, he stopped by the driver's side window. I could feel his presence, cold and heavy, like he was draining the air from the car. Then he knocked. It was a soft, almost polite knock, but it felt like a gunshot in the stillness. "Roll down the window," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I need help." I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. "Please," he said, knocking again. "It's so cold out here." The woman beside me was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut. "Don't," she whispered. The man circled the car, his footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. He stopped by her window and knocked again. "Let me in," he said, his voice a little sharper now. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. After what felt like an eternity, the man stopped knocking. He stood there for a moment, silent and still, and then he started walking away, disappearing into the darkness. The car roared to life without me even touching the key. "Drive," the woman said, her voice urgent. I didn't need to be told twice. I floored it, speeding down the highway as fast as I could. The town lights of Turner Junction came into view, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. When I pulled into the gas station on the edge of town, I turned to look at her, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the journal was sitting there, its leather cover still damp and cold. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The man's face, those empty eyes, haunted me every time I closed my own. I tried to return the journal to the gas station attendant, thinking maybe someone would claim it, but he just stared at me like I was crazy. Buddy, he said, his voice low, you're not the first to tell a story like that, and you won't be the last. I left the journal there and drove back to school, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I think I see him, just a shadow in the distance, standing by the side of the road, waiting for someone to stop. My name is Megan, and for a long time, I didn't believe in anything supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, cursed objects. They were all just tales people told to make the world seem more mysterious than it really was. But then, something happened that made me question everything. It started when my family moved into an old house in a quiet, wooded part of town. My parents had always dreamed of owning a Victorian-style home, and when this one came up for sale at a ridiculously low price, they jumped on it. I wasn't thrilled about the move. I was 16, and the idea of starting over at a new school was bad enough. But the house itself gave me the creeps. It wasn't just that it was old. It was the way it seemed to hold on to its history. The floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. The air inside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on you. And then there was the staircase. The staircase was the centerpiece of the house, a grand wooden structure that spiraled up to the second floor. It was beautiful, sure, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way the shadows clung to it, even during the day. Or maybe it was the strange stain on the bottom step, a dark, irregular mark that no amount of scrubbing could remove. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, old houses have quirks, right? But things started happening. Little things at first. One evening, about a week after we moved in, I was doing homework in my room when I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, the kind of sound you'd expect from someone wearing heavy boots. Dad, I called out, assuming he was checking the attic or something. No answer. The footsteps continued, moving up the stairs one step at a time. Mom? I tried again, my voice louder now. Still no answer. I got up and peeked out into the hallway. The staircase was empty, but the footsteps kept coming. They were on the second floor now, moving closer to my room. My heart was pounding as I stepped back and shut my door, locking it for good measure. The footsteps stopped just outside. Hello? I whispered, barely able to get the word out. Nothing. After a few minutes of silence, I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, and the air felt colder than before. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning at breakfast, I told my parents what I'd heard. My mom laughed it off, saying it was probably a squirrel in the walls. My dad shrugged and said old houses make noise. But my little brother, Ethan, looked at me with wide, nervous eyes. I heard it too, he said quietly. Last night, it came into my room. That sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean, it came into your room? I asked. Ethan hesitated, glancing at our parents like he wasn't sure if he should say more. It was just a shadow, he said finally. But it moved, Megan. It wasn't like a normal shadow. I didn't know what to say to that. Things escalated after that. Over the next few weeks, we all started noticing strange things. Lights flickering even though the wiring had been inspected. Doors opening and closing on their own. Cold spots in random parts of the house. But it always came back to the staircase. One night, I was up late studying for a history test when I heard Ethan scream. I bolted out of my room and ran to his. He was sitting up in bed, shaking, his face pale and wet with tears. It was there, he whispered, pointing toward the doorway. The shadow. It was on the stairs. I stayed with him that night, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing at the foot of the bed, watching us. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and asked the librarian if she knew anything about our house. She gave me a curious look and led me to the archives, where old newspaper clippings were stored. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In 1978, a family had lived in the house, a husband, wife, and their teenage daughter. According to the articles, the husband had been abusive, and one night, in a fit of rage, he'd pushed the wife down the stairs. She died instantly. The daughter, terrified and grief-stricken, had run away and was never found. The husband was arrested, but claimed it was an accident. The article included a photo of the family. The wife looked kind, with soft eyes and a gentle smile. But it was the staircase in the background of the photo that caught my attention. There, on the bottom step, was the same dark stain that was in our house. I felt sick. When I got home, I told my parents what I'd found. My mom looked uneasy, but my dad brushed it off, saying the past didn't matter. But it did matter. That night, I had a dream. Or at least, I think it was a dream. I was standing at the top of the staircase, looking down. The house was dark and silent, and the air was thick with the smell of something metallic and sour. I saw her, the woman from the photo. She was at the bottom of the stairs, lying in a heap. Her neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were wide open, staring right at me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice thin and raspy. I woke up gasping for air, my heart racing. The room was freezing, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The next day, I convinced Ethan to stay at a friend's house for the night. I didn't want him anywhere near the staircase. That evening, I sat at the top of the stairs, waiting. I don't know what I was expecting, but I felt like I needed to confront whatever was haunting our house. At midnight, the temperature dropped. The air grew so cold I could see my breath, and the shadows on the staircase seemed to shift, growing darker and more defined. And then I saw it. A figure, barely more than a shadow, began to form on the bottom step. It moved slowly, deliberately, climbing the stairs one step at a time. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It kept climbing, its form flickering like a dying flame. When it reached the top step, it stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, its face featureless and hollow. Then it raised a hand and pointed down the hallway toward my parents' room. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Leave them alone." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then it dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the faint smell of metal. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me at first, but when they saw the fear in my eyes, they finally agreed to move out. We sold the house a few weeks later. The new owners seemed excited, and I didn't have the heart to warn them. It's been years since we left, but I still think about that night. About the shadow on the staircase and the woman who whispered for help. Some things don't stay in the past. Some things linger, waiting for someone to notice them. And some things, like the shadow on the staircase, never really leave. I'm Sam, and I've always loved hiking. There's something peaceful about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and silence. But there's one trip I'll never forget. One that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It was late October when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend in the mountains. The air was crisp, the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the trails were quiet now that summer had ended. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Jake, and our 2 friends, Emily and Sarah. We planned to hike a long loop trail, camp overnight, and make it back to the car the next day. We packed everything we'd need: tents, sleeping bags, enough food for a couple of days, and a map of the area. The hike started out great. The trail wound through dense forests, past crystal-clear streams, and up rocky hillsides with breathtaking views. We laughed, told stories, and took way too many pictures. But things started to feel off as the sun began to set. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that the forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping, and the usual rustling of leaves in the wind seemed muted. Even the air felt heavier, colder than it should have been for an autumn evening. "We should find a spot to set up camp," Jake said, checking his watch. It's getting dark fast. We agreed and started looking for a flat, open area. That's when Emily spotted it, a small clearing just off the trail. There, she said, pointing. The clearing was perfect. Flat ground, a ring of trees to block the wind, and even a fire pit someone had built and left behind. But as we stepped into it, I felt a strange unease, like we were intruding on something we shouldn't. Creepy vibes, Sarah muttered, shivering. You're just cold, Jake teased, pulling a tarp out of his pack. We set up camp, built a fire, and ate dinner. As the flames crackled, the tension I'd felt earlier started to fade. We talked and laughed, the way we always did, until Emily brought up the map. Hey, she said, spreading it out on the ground. There's a cabin marked here. It's not far from where we are. Jake leaned over to look. Huh, that's weird. It's not on the GPS map. Probably some old ranger station or something, I said. We should check it out tomorrow, Emily said, her eyes lighting up. Sarah groaned. Why? We've got enough spooky woods for one trip, thanks. But Emily was insistent, and eventually, we agreed to look for the cabin in the morning. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like someone whispering just outside the tent. I froze, straining to listen. The fire had burned down to embers, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and jagged across the clearing. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't words, just a low, breathy murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. Jake, I hissed, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and rolled over. What? Do you hear that? He sat up, rubbing his eyes. For a moment, we both listened in silence. Then we heard it, a soft, deliberate snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. Jake grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. He shone the beam around the clearing, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. Probably an animal, he muttered, lying back down, but I wasn't so sure. The next morning, we packed up and set off toward the cabin. The trail wasn't marked, but the map showed a rough path leading through the woods. It wasn't long before the forest started to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches forming a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was damp and smelled faintly of decay. Are we sure this is the right way? Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the map. Positive, Emily said, though her voice wavered. After about an hour, we saw it, a dark shape looming in the distance. The cabin. It was small and weathered, with moss growing up the sides and shutters hanging crookedly from the windows. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. This is definitely haunted, Sarah said, stopping a few feet away. Jake laughed. It's just an old building. Come on. He led the way inside, and we followed, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. The interior was worse than I'd expected. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the walls were stained with something dark and foul-smelling. Old furniture lay broken and scattered, and a rusted wood stove sat in one corner. But it was the writing that caught my attention. Words and symbols were scrawled all over the walls, carved deep into the wood. Some of it was in English, phrases like, "Stay away and don't look at it." But most of it was in a language I didn't recognize. Who the hell lived here? Jake said, shining his flashlight across the walls. Let's go, Sarah said, backing toward the door. This place is wrong. Emily stepped into the next room, and we heard her gasp. Guys, she called, come look at this. Reluctantly, we joined her. The room was smaller, with a single wooden table in the center. On it sat an old journal, its cover cracked and faded. Emily opened it, flipping through the pages. It's a diary, she said. Listen to this. She read aloud. It comes at night, always the same time. I can hear it outside, scratching at the walls. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. If you find this, leave. Don't wait. Don't let it in. The room felt colder, darker, as she read. Okay, we're done here, Sarah said, her voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, we heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. What was that? I whispered. No one answered. We stood frozen, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. Run, Jake said, his voice barely audible. We bolted from the cabin, sprinting back toward the trail. The growling followed us, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. We ran until we reached the clearing where we'd camped the night before. Only then did we stop, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Sarah said, her face pale. No one had an answer. We made it back to the car later that afternoon, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. I saw the symbols on the walls, glowing faintly in the dark. I heard the growling, the footsteps, and something else, whispering, like a voice calling my name. When I woke up, I found a mark on my arm. 3 thin, parallel scratches, as if something had clawed me in my sleep. I never went hiking again after that. Whatever we encountered in those woods, it wasn't human, and it wasn't done with us. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the growling. I still see the cabin in my dreams, and I wonder if someday I'll wake up to find myself back there. I never wanted a roommate. After my last disaster of a living situation, I decided to go solo when I moved into the small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, quiet, affordable, and close to my new job. The landlord told me it had been vacant for a while, which made sense since the building was a bit run down. At first, everything was great. I settled in, decorated the way I liked, and enjoyed the peace. But after a couple of weeks, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable changes. I'd leave a glass on the kitchen counter and find it in the sink when I came back. My closet door, which I always left closed, would be slightly ajar. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. After all, moving and starting a new job was stressful. But then, one night, I heard it. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps. They weren't outside or in the hallway. They were inside my apartment. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving from the kitchen toward the living room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my phone and a heavy flashlight from the nightstand. As I crept out of my bedroom, my palms were slick with sweat. The apartment was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. "Is someone here?" I asked, flicking on the flashlight. No answer. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. There was no one there. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. I'd wake up to find cabinet doors wide open, lights on in rooms I hadn't entered, and items moved from one side of the apartment to the other. One morning, I found a message scrawled in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. It wasn't words, exactly, just 3 long, parallel lines, like claw marks. That was when I started to feel genuinely scared. I told my best friend, Mia, about it over coffee. She laughed it off, saying it was probably my imagination or stress playing tricks on me. "Your mind can do crazy things when you're overtired," she said. "You're probably sleepwalking or something." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. A week later, I came home from work to find the apartment freezing. I checked the thermostat. It was set to 70, but the air felt icy. "Great," I muttered. The heat's busted. As I walked toward the living room, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The couch cushions had been rearranged into a rough circle on the floor. In the center of the circle was a small pile of objects. My keys, a fork from the kitchen, a single sock, and an old photograph I didn't recognize. The photo was black and white, grainy, and showed a man and woman standing in front of a house. They looked happy, but there was something strange about the way the man's face was blurred, as if he'd moved when the picture was taken. I picked up the photo, my hands shaking. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. A sudden noise made me jump, a sharp knock, like someone rapping on the window. I spun around, but there was no one there. That night, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and went to Mia's apartment. "You're seriously freaking yourself out over nothing," she said as I explained what had happened. "But if it makes you feel better, stay here for a few days." The next morning, I called my landlord and told him about the strange things happening in the apartment. He seemed uneasy but said he'd look into it. A few hours later, he called me back. You said you found a photo? He asked, his voice tense. Yeah. Do you know anything about it? There was a long pause before he answered. The last tenant. She mentioned something about a photo too. She said she kept finding it in different places around the apartment. What happened to her? I asked. She moved out, he said quickly. Look, I'll refund your last month's rent if you want to leave. No hard feelings. That was all I needed to hear. I went back to the apartment that evening to pack my things. Mia came with me, insisting she wouldn't let me go alone. The moment we walked in, the air felt wrong. It was colder than before, and the silence was oppressive, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. We started packing in a hurry, tossing clothes into suitcases and throwing dishes into boxes. What's this? Mia asked, holding up the photo I'd found earlier. I hadn't touched it since the night before, but now it was lying on the kitchen counter. I don't know, I said. It was in the circle of cushions. Mia frowned. This is so weird. You should show it to someone. Maybe it's from the previous tenant or... A loud crash interrupted her. We froze, staring at each other, then turned toward the living room. The coffee table had flipped over, and the couch cushions were scattered across the floor again. We need to leave, I said, grabbing my bag. As we headed for the door, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Mia, go, I shouted, shoving her toward the exit. But before we could reach it, the door slammed shut on its own. Open it, Mia cried, yanking at the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. Behind us, the sound of footsteps echoed in the dark, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam landed on the far corner of the room, where a figure stood. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and translucent. Its face was a blank, featureless mask, and its long, bony fingers twitched as it stepped closer. Who are you? I demanded, though my voice shook. The figure didn't answer. It raised one hand and pointed at the photograph in Mia's hand. Give it to it, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my hands shaking as I took the photo and placed it on the floor. The figure stopped, staring at the photo for a long moment. Then, without a sound, it faded into the darkness. The door creaked open. We didn't stick around after that. We grabbed what we could and ran. The landlord refunded my deposit, as promised, but I never went back to the apartment. A few weeks later, I did some digging into the building's history. It turned out the man in the photo had been the original owner of the property back in the 1950s. He'd been accused of killing his wife in the apartment, but was never convicted. He died shortly after under mysterious circumstances. As for the photograph, I left it behind. Wherever it is now, I hope it stays there. Because sometimes the past doesn't just haunt a place. Sometimes it takes up residence. My name is Danny, and I work as a truck driver. I've seen all kinds of strange things during late-night drives, but nothing compares to the night I picked up a hitchhiker who wasn't supposed to exist. It was a quiet Tuesday night in early November, and I was hauling a load of equipment across a desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest. The road was nearly empty, with only the occasional passing car, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion, I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched. She looked young, maybe early 20s, wearing jeans, a hoodie, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. Her dark hair fell over her face, and she seemed shivering from the cold. I don't usually stop for hitchhikers, but something about her seemed desperate, like she really needed help. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Where you headed?" I asked, rolling down the passenger side window. She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting mine. "Just a few miles up the road. Is that okay?" "Sure," I said, unlocking the door. She climbed in, clutching her backpack tightly. As I got back on the road, she introduced herself as Lily. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, and she spoke with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Thanks for stopping," she said. "It's been a long night." "No problem," I replied. "What are you doing out here alone?" Her expression flickered, just for a moment, but then she shrugged. "Just needed to get away, I guess." I didn't press her for details. I figured she had her reasons. We drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about her was off. Her clothes looked a little outdated, like they were from another decade, and she kept glancing out the window, as if expecting to see someone following us. "So, where am I dropping you off?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. She hesitated before answering. "There's an old diner up ahead. You can let me out there." I frowned. I'd driven this route dozens of times and didn't remember any diner. But then again, it was late, and I might have just missed it before. "Sure thing," I said. A few minutes later, she spoke again. "You're kind, you know. Most people wouldn't stop." Her words caught me off guard. "Well, I figure we all need a little help now and then." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We were approaching a curve in the road when she suddenly gasped, clutching my arm. "Slow down," she cried. Startled, I hit the brakes, bringing the truck to a crawl. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart racing. "There," she said, pointing. In the glow of my headlights, I saw it. A large deer standing in the middle of the road. If I hadn't slowed down, I would have hit it for sure. "Good eyes," I said, glancing at her. But she wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale and tense. I turned back to the road, but the deer was gone. "What the?" I muttered. "It's fine now," she said softly. "Just keep driving." We reached the diner about 10 minutes later. At least, that's what she called it. To me, it looked more like an old, abandoned building with faded paint and broken windows. "This is it," she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "You sure?" I asked, eyeing the crumbling structure. She nodded, opening the door. "Thanks again for the ride." Before I could say anything else, she was gone, disappearing into the shadows. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her, but something about the place made my skin crawl. Finally, I put the truck in gear and drove away. I couldn't stop thinking about Lily. The whole thing felt surreal, like a half-remembered dream. The next day, I stopped at a truck stop to grab a coffee and decided to ask the cashier if she knew anything about the diner. "You mean that old place on Route 17? She asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, I dropped someone off there last night." Her expression turned serious. "That place has been abandoned for years. Nobody goes there anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Back in the 80s, a young woman was killed there. Hitchhiker, just like you described. They never caught the guy who did it." A chill ran down my spine. "What was her name?" I asked. "Lily," she said. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're kidding, right?" She shook her head. "No joke. They say her spirit still roams that stretch of highway, looking for a ride. Most folks around here won't stop if they see someone hitchhiking at night." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to drive back to the diner. I told myself it was just to prove the cashier wrong, to convince myself that what I'd experienced was real. When I arrived, the building looked even worse in daylight. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in, and the whole place reeked of decay. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. On one of the walls, someone had scratched a name into the peeling paint. Lily. Beneath it was a date, November 3rd, 1984. My heart pounded as I realized what day it was. November 3rd, exactly 40 years since she'd died. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Lying on the floor was a small backpack. It was old and worn, but I recognized it instantly. It was the same one Lily had been carrying. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I think about her. The way she looked, the way she spoke, and the way she disappeared into the shadows without a trace. And every now and then, when I'm driving that stretch of highway, I swear I see her standing by the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, waiting for her next ride. If you ever find yourself on Route 17 late at night, do yourself a favor. Don't stop. When I first moved to the city, I wasn't looking for much. Just a cheap apartment close to my new job, something small and manageable while I figured things out. I found it in an older building downtown. The rent was low, and my landlord, Mrs. Hewitt, was a sweet older lady who lived on the first floor. Apartment 3B has been empty for a while. She told me as I signed the lease. You'll have plenty of peace and quiet up there. I liked the sound of that. The first month went smoothly. The place was small but cozy, with creaky hardwood floors and a view of the bustling street below. I spent my evenings unpacking, watching movies, and enjoying my independence. But then, strange things started happening. It began with noises, soft creaks and footsteps coming from above. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the sounds were too deliberate. It was like someone was pacing back and forth, directly over my bedroom. The thing is, 3B was the top floor. There shouldn't have been anyone above me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably my imagination or maybe old pipes making noise. But as the days passed, the sounds got louder. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard a loud thud above me, followed by what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. I sat up, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The noises stopped. The next morning, I went to Mrs. Hewitt's apartment to ask her about it. "Is someone living in the attic above 3B?" I asked. She frowned. "There's no attic, just the roof, and it's locked. Only maintenance has access." "But I've been hearing noises," I insisted. "Footsteps, furniture moving. It's like someone's living up there." She gave me a sympathetic smile. "These old buildings can be noisy. You'll get used to it." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to press her. That night, the noises started again, louder than ever. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thud of footsteps. Suddenly, I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. Then, the sound moved downward. I bolted upright as I realized the scratching was coming from inside the wall next to my bed. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. "Help me," a voice whispered. I scrambled out of bed, my chest tight with fear. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. "Who's there?" I stammered. No response. The next day, I told my coworker Nate about what had happened. "Sounds like you've got a squatter or something," he said. "You should call the cops." I wasn't sure. The voice hadn't sounded threatening, more desperate, like someone trapped. That evening, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the roof access door. It was locked, just as Mrs. Hewitt had said, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The doorframe had fresh scratches around the lock, as if someone had been trying to force it open. My stomach churned. Back in my apartment, I pushed my dresser against the bedroom wall, hoping it would muffle any more noises. But that night, I heard nothing. I almost convinced myself it was over. Until the following evening. I came home late from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle. But then I noticed the dresser in my bedroom. It had been moved back to its original spot. My blood ran cold. I knew I hadn't touched it. I called Nate and told him what had happened. "Dude, that's messed up," he said. "You need to get out of there." He was right. I decided I'd stay one last night, pack up my things in the morning, and find somewhere else to live. But that night was the worst of all. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they weren't coming from above. They were in the hallway outside my door. I grabbed my phone and crept to the door, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking lightly. Then, a voice. "Let me in." It was barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable, the same voice I'd heard through the wall. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No response. I dialed 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. "We'll send someone right away," she said. I hung up and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. When the police arrived, they found no one in the hallway. The building was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place. One of the officers, a gruff-looking man in his 40s, asked me if I'd had any issues with neighbors. "There's no one above me," I said. "I'm on the top floor." He frowned. "We'll check the roof." A few minutes later, they returned, their faces grim. "We found signs that someone's been staying up there," the officer said. "Old blankets, Food wrappers. Looks like they've been coming and going through the fire escape. My stomach turned. You think they were getting into my apartment? I asked. It's possible, he admitted, but we didn't find anyone. Just be careful and call us if anything else happens. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak, sent my heart racing. By morning, I had packed up my belongings and called a moving company. I wasn't staying another night in that apartment. As I loaded the last box into my car, Mrs. Hewitt approached me, looking concerned. Leaving so soon? She asked. Yeah, I said. I just don't feel safe here. She nodded, her expression sad. I understand. You're not the first to say that. Her words sent a chill down my spine. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated before answering. The last tenant in 3B, she said she heard noises too. Saw things. Then one day, she just disappeared. Left all her stuff behind. I stared at her, speechless. That was 3 years ago. I moved to a new apartment across town and tried to put the whole thing behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The faint sound of footsteps, the soft whisper of a voice saying, "Let me in," and I wonder if the person who lived above me is still out there, searching for their next victim, or if they're still trapped in apartment 3B, waiting for someone to hear their cry for help. When I was younger, my dad used to take me and my brother, Sam, on camping trips every summer. We'd pack the car with gear, snacks, and a beat-up map of Michigan's remote forests, looking for the next great spot to pitch our tent. This story happened during what ended up being our last camping trip together. I was 17, Sam was 15, and Dad had just recovered from knee surgery. He wasn't as spry as he used to be, but he insisted on one more trip before the summer ended. We agreed, though I remember thinking it might not be as fun as it used to be. Dad had found this place called Stillwater Campground. It wasn't on the map, but he'd heard about it from a friend. It's quiet, out of the way, and right next to a lake, he said. Perfect for fishing. He wasn't wrong about the out-of-the-way part. The dirt road leading there was barely wide enough for our car, and we didn't see another vehicle or person the entire drive. When we finally arrived, it looked off. The campground wasn't well maintained. The grass was overgrown, and most of the fire pits were filled with ash and trash. There were no other campers, which felt strange given it was peak season. Looks like we've got the whole place to ourselves, Dad said cheerfully. Sam and I exchanged a glance. Something about the emptiness made my stomach churn. We picked a spot near the lake and set up our tent. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. For a moment, I forgot my unease and let myself enjoy the view. After dinner, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and listening to Dad's old stories. He was halfway through one about catching a giant fish when we heard it, a distant snap of a twig. We all froze, the crackling fire suddenly feeling too loud. Probably just an animal, Dad said, though his eyes flicked toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Sam and I nodded, but the mood had shifted. We called it a night shortly after. I woke up sometime after midnight, needing to use the bathroom. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. As I walked toward the woods, I noticed something strange. A faint light flickering in the distance, near the other end of the campground. Another camper? I whispered to myself. It didn't make sense. We hadn't seen anyone else all day. I debated waking Dad, but decided against it. I figured I'd check it out quickly and then head back to bed. The light led me to an old campsite, one we hadn't noticed before. There was a tent, but it was torn and weathered, like it had been abandoned for years. The light was coming from a lantern sitting on a tree stump. It looked modern and out of place, its glow casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight around. That's when I saw it, a trail of footprints in the dirt, leading from the tent into the woods. They weren't fresh, but they hadn't been there long either. A chill ran down my spine. I had this sudden, overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite. My heart was pounding as I shook Dad awake, stammering about what I'd seen. "Slow down," he said. sitting up. What kind of footprints? I don't know, I said. Human ones. And there was a lantern, but no one was there. He frowned but didn't dismiss me. Stay here, he said, grabbing his flashlight. No way, I said. I'm coming with you. Reluctantly, he agreed. We woke Sam and told him to stay by the fire while we checked it out. He protested but stayed behind. When we reached the campsite, the lantern was gone. The footprints, however, were still there, leading into the woods. See, I whispered. Dad knelt to examine the tracks. They're barefoot, he muttered. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Let's head back, he said after a moment. Nothing good comes from following someone into the woods at night. I didn't argue. Back at our campsite, Sam was pale and shaking. What's wrong? Dad asked. Sam pointed to the edge of the clearing. There was someone there, he said. They were just standing there, watching me. My blood turned to ice. Did you see their face? Dad asked. Sam shook his head. They were too far away, but they didn't move. They just stood there. Dad grabbed his hunting knife and kept it by his side for the rest of the night. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt the same unease. As we loaded the car, I noticed something on the edge of the campsite, a small pile of rocks stacked neatly, like a marker. It hadn't been there the night before. I called Dad over, and his face darkened when he saw it. Let's go, he said firmly. We were almost out of the woods when we passed a ranger station. Dad pulled over to report what had happened. The ranger, an older man with a weathered face, listened intently. When Dad mentioned Stillwater Campground, the ranger's expression changed. That place has been closed for years, he said. What? Dad asked. It wasn't gated or anything. The ranger shook his head. We don't maintain it anymore. Too many incidents. What kind of incidents? I asked, my throat dry. The ranger hesitated before answering. Disappearances. Campers going missing. Footprints leading nowhere. Strange sightings. We've never been able to figure it out, but people don't go there anymore. It's not safe. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. None of us wanted to talk about what had happened, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. What if the footprints hadn't been leading away from the tent? What if they'd been coming back? I haven't been camping since. Sometimes I think about the lantern, the footprints, and the figure Sam saw watching him. And I wonder if whoever, or whatever, was out there is still waiting for the next group of campers to stumble across that forgotten campground. If you ever find a place called Stillwater on an old map, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. When my mom and I moved into the house on Rivington Street, it felt like a fresh start. My parents had just divorced, and the tiny rental was all my mom could afford. It wasn't much, a 2-bedroom bungalow that smelled faintly of mildew, but it was ours. It's cozy, Mom said, forcing a smile as we unpacked. I nodded, though I couldn't shake the weird feeling I had about the place. The floors creaked even when no one was walking, and the basement door, which led to the crawl space, wouldn't stay closed no matter how hard we slammed it. The first strange thing happened about a week after we moved in. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard faint tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I opened my window, the noise stopped. I sat back down, and it started again. This time, it was louder and coming from the wall. I pressed my ear to it, my stomach twisting. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded deliberate, like someone was knocking softly from the other side. Mom? I called out. What? She yelled back from the kitchen. Do you hear that? Hear what? I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what to say. The tapping continued every night for the next few days. Sometimes it was faint and sporadic. Other times, it was loud and insistent. I told Mom about it, but she brushed it off. It's probably just the pipes, she said, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I crept down the stairs to the basement. The crawl space door was ajar, swinging gently as if caught in a breeze. But there was no breeze. I hesitated before pulling it open. The smell hit me first, a damp, earthy odor mixed with something sour, like rotting garbage. I shone my flashlight inside, illuminating the low, narrow space beneath the house. Cobwebs clung to the beams, and the dirt floor was littered with debris. Old bottles, crumpled newspapers, and what looked like a torn shoe. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. The next day, I told my best friend, Emma, about the tapping and the crawl space. "Maybe it's raccoons or something," she said. "My uncle had them in his attic once." "Raccoons don't knock," I replied. Emma shrugged. "If you're that freaked out, call an exterminator." I didn't have the heart to tell her we couldn't afford one. Instead, I convinced her to come over that night and help me investigate further. Around midnight, armed with flashlights and a kitchen knife, Emma's idea, we went back to the basement. The crawl space door was open again, though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. Emma glanced at me nervously. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted. We crouched at the entrance, shining our flashlights into the darkness. That's when we saw it. Scratches on the wooden beams, deep and jagged, like claw marks. "Raccoons don't do that," Emma whispered. I swallowed hard. "Let's just check it out quickly." We crawled inside, our knees sinking into the cold dirt. The air was thick and stale, and every sound, our breaths, the crunch of gravel, felt deafening. As we moved deeper into the space, my flashlight beam landed on something that made my heart stop. A mattress. It was old and filthy, with dark stains covering the fabric. Beside it was a pile of tattered blankets and a plastic bag filled with empty food wrappers. Emma grabbed my arm. "Someone's been living here," she whispered. I barely had time to process her words before we heard it. A low, guttural noise, like a deep breath exhaling from somewhere in the darkness. We froze. Then, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from behind us. We scrambled out of the crawl space as fast as we could, our flashlights bobbing wildly. I tripped on the way out, scraping my knees, but I didn't stop. When we reached the basement stairs, we slammed the door shut and shoved a chair under the handle. "What was that?" Emma hissed, her face pale. "I don't know," I whispered, my chest heaving. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I begged Mom to call the police. "Over some noises," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not wasting their time." I told her about the mattress, the food wrappers, and the scratches, but she brushed it off. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you." Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands. That afternoon, while Mom was at work, I went back to the crawl space. This time, I brought my phone and a crowbar. The mattress was still there, along with the blankets and trash. I took a few pictures, planning to show them to Mom later. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small, rectangular opening in the far wall, just big enough for a person to crawl through. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and peered inside, shining my flashlight into the narrow tunnel. It stretched for about 10 feet before opening into another small chamber. And in that chamber, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A wooden box, about the size of a trunk, with rusted hinges and a heavy padlock. I didn't dare go closer. That night, I showed Mom the pictures and told her about the box. Her face finally registered concern. "Okay, we'll call someone," she said. But before we could, things escalated. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be Mom's. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The steps moved down the hall, stopping outside my door. Then came the tapping. Soft, rhythmic, like knuckles gently rapping against the wood. "Mom?" I whispered. No answer. The doorknob jiggled. I grabbed my phone and texted Emma. "Someone's in the house." She replied immediately, "Call the police." I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I whispered my address to the operator. The footsteps moved away from my door, heading toward Mom's room. "Mom!" I screamed, bolting out of bed. I burst into her room to find her standing by the window, pale and trembling. "I saw him," she said. "There was a man outside, staring up at me." Before I could respond, we heard it, the basement door creaking open. The police arrived within minutes, but the man was gone. They searched the crawl space and found the box. Inside were old Polaroids, dozens of them, showing the previous tenants of the house. Some were candid shots taken through windows. Others were more disturbing. People sleeping, eating, completely unaware they were being watched. At the bottom of the box was a journal, its pages filled with ramblings about claiming the house and its occupants. The police believed the man had been living in the crawl space for months, maybe longer, sneaking out at night to watch us. They never found him. We moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. Sometimes I still hear the tapping in my dreams, soft and insistent, like a reminder that he's still out there, watching, waiting. It was a crisp autumn evening when I moved into the apartment on Birch Street. I was 22, just starting my career as a graphic designer, and had found the perfect place, affordable, quaint, and located in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The building was old, but it had character, and the landlord, a woman named Mrs. Holloway, seemed nice enough. The apartment was on the second floor, a cozy one-bedroom with a small kitchen and living room. There was an antique fireplace in the corner of the living room, though it hadn't been used in years, and the floors creaked beneath my feet. Despite the faint smell of mothballs and the peeling wallpaper, it felt like a place I could call home. The first few weeks went by uneventfully. I settled in, rearranged the furniture a couple of times, and tried to get to know the neighbors. The building wasn't very big, only 8 units, and most of the residents seemed to keep to themselves. There was Mr. Grant, who lived across from me, an older man who mostly kept to himself, only leaving his apartment to take his small dog for walks. Then there was Mrs. Peters, a young woman in her late 20s who lived at the end of the hall. She was friendly but often rushed around, always too busy to chat. But there was one neighbor who I never met, apartment number 3, the one next to mine. I'd never seen anyone come in or out of there, and the blinds were always drawn tight. At first, I figured they were just a private person, or maybe the apartment was vacant. But after a few weeks, I started to notice something strange. It was late one Friday evening when I first heard it. A soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. I was sitting on the couch, binge-watching a show when I froze. The noise had come from next door, apartment 3. I didn't think much of it at first. It could have been anything. A book falling, furniture shifting, but then I heard it again. Thud. This time, it was followed by a low scraping sound. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that maybe the tenant was just moving something heavy. But the noise kept going, rhythmic, like someone was dragging furniture across the floor. It was unsettling, especially at this hour. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. The noises continued for another hour, until they suddenly stopped. The next day, I saw Mr. Grant in the hallway as I was heading out to grab groceries. "Hey, have you heard anything strange from next door?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He gave me a puzzled look. "Strange? You mean the people in number 3? I haven't heard anything." I nodded, though I didn't really believe him. He'd been living in the building for years, so I assumed he'd know if something unusual was going on. Later that afternoon, I decided to go up to Mrs. Holloway's apartment to ask about number 3. Mrs. Holloway was always around, tending to the building, and I figured she might know if the tenant was new or if something was going on. When I mentioned apartment 3, she paused for a moment, a strange look crossing her face. "There's no one living there right now," she said, her voice low. "It's been vacant for months." I frowned. "Then who's making the noise?" Mrs. Holloway didn't answer right away. She seemed lost in thought for a moment, before quickly changing the subject. "Well, you let me know if you need anything, dear." I left her apartment feeling uneasy. If the apartment was vacant, then who, or what, had been making those noises? That night, I decided to do a little investigating. The noises from apartment 3 had been unsettling enough that I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I waited until it was quiet, after midnight. The building was dark, with only the sound of the occasional car passing by. I crept down the hallway toward apartment 3, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to catch a glimpse of the dark hallway beyond. I hesitated. I didn't want to invade someone's privacy, but curiosity got the better of me. I gently pushed the door open. The apartment was completely dark, save for the faint light coming from the hallway. It looked like no one had been there in a long time. The floor was covered in dust, and the air smelled stale. But there was something else, a faint odor of something decaying, like spoiled food or mold. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. I was about to turn around and leave when I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The faintest outline of a figure, sitting in the corner of the room. I blinked, staring at the corner. There was no one there. But then I saw it again. The outline wasn't human. It was more like a shadow, a shifting mass of dark energy that seemed to pulse in the darkness. I took a step backward, my heart racing, and then I heard it, the softest of whispers. "Get out." I froze. I couldn't move. The voice was barely audible, like a breath on the back of my neck. I slowly backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off the corner. The shadow didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me. Just as I reached the door, I heard it again. "Get out." I slammed the door shut and ran back to my apartment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The next day, I told Mr. Grant about what had happened. He was skeptical, of course. "You probably just imagined it," he said. "There's no one living there. You've probably just got the creeps from the empty place." But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in that apartment. I decided to visit Mrs. Holloway again. This time, I told her everything I had seen and heard, the noises, the shadow, and the whisper. She listened in silence, her face pale. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The last tenant who lived in apartment 3, he was a strange man. He didn't talk much, and he never really interacted with anyone. But every night, I'd hear him walking around. It was like he was pacing the floors, back and forth, never stopping. But one night, he just stopped. I never heard from him again. And when I went in to check, his apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing. Like he just vanished. I felt a chill run down my spine. Mrs. Holloway's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some of the neighbors say they've seen him in the hallways at night, but I don't believe it. That man is gone. But his presence, his energy, I think it's still here." I couldn't speak. The idea that something was still lingering in that apartment, that it had somehow followed me, made my blood run cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the soft creaking of floorboards, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the building. I tried to convince myself that it was just the old wood settling, but deep down, I knew it was something else. At around 2 a.m., I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone pacing in the hallway, slow and methodical. I grabbed my phone and crept to the door, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside my apartment, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard the softest whisper, just barely audible. "Let me in." I ran to the window, my heart racing. I couldn't look out. I couldn't face whatever was out there. And then, the footsteps started again, moving away, fading into the distance. I never saw my neighbor from apartment 3. But after that night, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been living in that apartment was not human, and it was still here, waiting. I've always been a sucker for the thrill of a good ghost story. Ever since I was a kid, I'd watch horror films, read spooky novels, and listen to the chilling tales my friends would tell me around campfires. But I never really believed in the supernatural. I was too logical for that. It's hard to believe in things you can't see or touch, right? That was until the night I found myself driving down Route 19 on a rainy October evening. It was supposed to be a short, uneventful trip, just a 2-hour drive to visit an old college friend in the small town of Brookhaven. The rain was coming down in sheets, making the road slick and dangerous. But I was used to driving in bad weather, and I had plenty of time to make the trip. The only thing that seemed odd was how empty the roads were. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. The night was dark, almost too dark, with only the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the fog. The trees on either side of the road seemed to loom like dark shadows, stretching their limbs across the pavement. It was the kind of weather that made you feel like something was lurking just out of sight. As I neared a stretch of the road that ran along a thick forest, I saw something strange ahead. There was a figure standing by the side of the road, holding out their hand. My first instinct was to keep driving. I had heard stories about hitchhikers being dangerous, people pretending to be stranded, only to attack once they were inside the car. But something in the pit of my stomach told me I couldn't just drive past. I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to hear the person. A man stood there, drenched from the rain, his clothes clinging to his frame. He looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with dark, messy hair and a scruffy beard. His face was pale, but it wasn't just the rain. There was something unsettling about his expression. His eyes were wide, almost frantic. "Hey," I said cautiously, "you need a ride?" The man nodded quickly, glancing over his shoulder as if something was chasing him. "Please, I need to get to Brookhaven," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't have much time. Please." Something about his tone made me hesitate, but I couldn't leave him out there in the storm. "All right, get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. He climbed into the car quickly, his wet clothes leaving a damp spot on the seat. As soon as he was inside, I started driving again, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. The man was breathing heavily, like he had run a long distance. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "So, what's going on? Why are you out here in the middle of nowhere?" He didn't answer right away. His hands were trembling as he wiped rainwater off his face. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. I think I'm being followed. I saw something in the woods." I glanced over at him, trying to make sense of his words. "You're being followed? By who?" The man looked at me like he was afraid to speak. "I don't know who, but something's after me." He shuddered. "It's not human." My grip tightened on the steering wheel, a cold chill creeping up my spine. The weather outside was getting worse, and the fog was thickening. It was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. "All right, man. Just calm down. We're almost in Brookhaven," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own nerves were starting to spike. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the sound of the rain pounding against the windshield the only noise in the car. The tension in the air was palpable. But then, out of nowhere, the man spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to come back." I frowned, glancing at him. "What do you mean?" His eyes locked with mine, and there was a wild look in them now, like he was on the verge of losing control. "Brookhaven isn't what it seems," he said, his voice trembling. "Something bad happened there. Something terrible. I saw it, and now it's coming for me." At that moment, I wasn't sure if I should laugh or be terrified. I figured he was probably just some guy who had too much to drink and was spouting nonsense. But the way he was acting, the desperation in his voice, made me question my instincts. We reached the outskirts of Brookhaven, and the man grew even more agitated. "Stop! Stop the car!" he suddenly screamed. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding a little on the slick road. I turned to look at him, alarmed. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He was staring out of the window, his face pale, his body trembling. "It's here," he whispered. "It's coming. You have to turn around. You don't understand. If we don't leave, we're both going to die." I was beginning to panic myself, but before I could respond, he yanked the door handle and threw himself out of the car. "Hey, wait," I shouted, but he was already running into the dark, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the rain. I sat there in shock for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I follow him? Should I drive away? My instincts told me to leave, but something was tugging at me to go after him. Against my better judgment, I put the car in reverse and followed the direction he had run in. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the rain made everything blurry. And that's when I saw it, him. The man was standing by the side of the road again, but he wasn't alone. There was something with him, a tall, thin figure, barely visible, standing just beyond the tree line. Its shape was distorted, as if it were made of shadows. It was watching me. My heart raced as the man stumbled toward the figure. "No!" he screamed, backing away. "Please, I didn't mean to come back. I didn't mean to come back." I felt paralyzed. The figure didn't move, but the man was shaking violently now, his hands raised in front of him like he was trying to shield himself. And then, the figure moved. It was so fast, faster than anything human could be. It reached the man in an instant, grabbing him by the shoulders and pulling him into the trees. His screams echoed through the night, but they were quickly cut off. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stare, helpless, as the shadows consumed him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The rain was still pouring down, but there was no sound, no wind, no footsteps, no scream. Only the steady hum of the car's engine and the pounding rain against the windshield. I sat there for what felt like an eternity before I finally forced myself to turn the car around. I didn't dare go back. I didn't dare look. I drove straight through Brookhaven, not stopping until I was miles away. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. The next day, I called the police, but they told me there were no reports of anyone missing. They said there was no record of a man matching the description I gave. When I asked about Brookhaven, they told me the town had been mostly abandoned for years. The last residents had moved out after a series of strange disappearances. I didn't tell them about the figure in the woods. I couldn't. I still don't know who or what that man was. I don't know what he was running from or why he was so terrified. But I know one thing for sure. There's something out there, something dark and ancient, and it's still hunting in the woods of Brookhaven. And I don't ever want to go back. I've never been one to believe in urban legends or ghost stories. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until one evening, when everything changed, and I saw something I can never forget. It all started on a cold evening in late November. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby homes. I was 18 at the time, still in high school, and I'd just finished a late shift at the local diner. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I pulled out of the parking lot, exhausted but ready to get home and unwind. The quickest route to my house was down Mill Road. It was a narrow, two-lane road that cut through the woods on the outskirts of town, bordered by dense trees that looked eerie at night, especially when the fog rolled in. Most people avoided it after dark, claiming that it was cursed or haunted. Stories of people vanishing or hearing strange noises at night had been passed down for generations. But I wasn't afraid. I had driven down Mill Road countless times, even late at night, without incident. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I certainly didn't believe in curses. That night, as I made my way down the road, the mist seemed heavier than usual. It clung to the trees, wrapping around the road like a shroud. The headlights barely cut through the fog, and the only sound was the tires on wet asphalt. It felt like driving through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It wasn't unusual to see someone walking along the road late at night, but something about this figure caught my attention. They were standing perfectly still, their back to the road, almost like they were waiting for something, or someone. I slowed down, instinctively glancing at the person. It was a woman, wearing a long coat and dark boots. Her hair was long, cascading down her back, and she appeared to be looking at the ground. I was about to pass her when, almost as if she sensed my car approaching, she turned around abruptly. I slammed on the brakes. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide and empty, like someone who had seen something horrifying and couldn't look away. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, as though she was holding something back. "Are you all right?" I called out through the window, trying to get a better look. She didn't answer. She just stared at me with those hollow eyes. I was about to roll up the window and drive off when I noticed something strange. The woman was barefoot. Her feet were covered in dirt and twigs, and she was standing in a patch of wet grass, but she didn't seem to be bothered by the cold or the wetness. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound kind, though I felt a shiver run down my spine. For a moment, she didn't move, and I wondered if she'd even heard me. Then, without a word, she took a step toward my car. I wasn't sure what came over me, but before I could stop myself, I unlocked the passenger door. The woman climbed in without a word, her wet clothes leaving a damp trail on the seat. I couldn't help but notice that she didn't look like she belonged in my town. There was something about her, something off. I tried to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "I don't know," she replied softly, her voice distant and hollow. I don't know where I'm going. I glanced over at her, trying to gauge whether she was in shock or just mentally disconnected. She didn't seem to be in any pain, but there was a strange air about her. Her gaze was fixed out the window, and she wasn't looking at anything in particular. Are you lost? I asked, hoping to spark some conversation. But instead of answering, she looked at me, her eyes searching my face as if she were trying to figure me out. Then, in a low, almost inaudible voice, she said, You shouldn't have picked me up. The words sent a chill through me, but I brushed it off. It was probably just a strange, tired person who had wandered off from a nearby house. I wasn't going to judge. After a few more minutes of tense silence, I turned onto the road that would lead me to my neighborhood. But then something happened that made my blood run cold. The woman gasped, suddenly straightening in her seat. I whipped my head around, alarmed. What's wrong? Stop the car, she said, her voice frantic. What? Why? Is something? Stop the car, now, she screamed, her eyes wide with panic. I hit the brakes, screeching to a halt. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to look at her. She was staring at the rearview mirror, her expression twisted in fear. I looked in the mirror, expecting to see something following us, maybe another car or a person on foot. But there was nothing behind us, just the empty, fog-shrouded road. There's nothing there, I said, my voice shaky. You're okay. It's just the fog playing tricks on you. But she wasn't listening. She was shaking now, her hands trembling. It's too late, she whispered. They're coming for me. You shouldn't have picked me up. It's your fault now. The panic in her voice was so raw, so real, that I felt my stomach churn. I didn't know what she was talking about, but I needed to get her home and away from whatever was bothering her. I put the car back into gear and started driving again, trying to keep my calm. We were just a few miles from my house when it happened. I was halfway through a turn when the car suddenly stalled. The engine sputtered and died. What the hell? I muttered, trying to restart the car. But it wouldn't turn over. I looked over at the woman. She was staring straight ahead now, her eyes fixed on something out in the distance. Do you know anything about cars? I asked, my hands trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she just started murmuring something under her breath. It was low, almost like a chant. I reached for my phone to call for help, but the screen was black. No signal. I cursed under my breath. It was as if the whole world had gone silent, as if we were trapped in some kind of void. And then I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching the car. My heart raced. I looked up, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the woman's voice broke the silence. It's time, she whispered, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. The temperature in the car dropped dramatically. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I looked out the window, and that's when I saw them. Figures, standing in the fog, barely visible at first, but then becoming clearer. They were tall, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved silently, their limbs unnaturally long, like something out of a nightmare. My heart stopped in my chest as I realized what was happening. They were coming for us. I tried to open the door, but the locks wouldn't budge. I tried to roll down the window, but the mechanism was frozen. It was like we were sealed inside. I looked at the woman one last time. She was staring at me with those empty eyes, a faint smile curling on her lips. You shouldn't have picked me up, she said softly, before the darkness swallowed her whole. When the police found my car the next morning, I was unconscious in the driver's seat, drenched in cold sweat, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. There was no sign of the woman, no footprints, nothing that indicated anyone had ever been there. They said it was a panic attack, that I must have imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that Mill Road will never be the same for me again. Because sometimes, when you pick up a stranger, you don't just pick up a person. You pick up a curse. The first time I heard about the house on Hollow Hill, it was in whispers. It wasn't something anyone talked about openly, but everyone in town knew about it. They said the house had been abandoned for years, that it had been cursed, and that anyone who had lived there before had met a terrible end. But that was just town gossip, right? Everyone loves a good story, especially one that's tied to an old house with a dark history. I didn't believe in that stuff. I'd never been one to buy into ghost stories, curses, or any of the superstitions people talked about. So, when my friend Sarah dared me to go check out Hollow Hill House one evening, I figured it would be a great way to prove just how ridiculous these stories were. I should have listened to my instincts, but I didn't. It was a late autumn evening when Sarah and I set out. The air was crisp, and the leaves had mostly fallen from the trees. The road leading to Hollow Hill was winding, narrow, and surrounded by thick woods. As we drove closer, I felt a sense of unease wash over me, though I brushed it off. There was something about the place. It looked abandoned. The house sat at the top of a steep hill, its windows boarded up and the porch sagging from years of neglect. The whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was usually the brave one, the one who loved a good challenge. But even she seemed to sense the strange energy hanging in the air. "Of course," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I turned off the car and parked in front of the driveway. The house loomed in front of us like a giant, dark creature watching us. We both got out of the car and made our way toward the front gate, which creaked on its hinges as we pushed it open. The wind whispered through the trees, and the house seemed to groan under its own weight. I glanced at Sarah, but she was already staring up at the dark windows, her face pale. "Let's just get inside and see if there's anything spooky," I said, trying to lighten the mood. The door was locked, but it wasn't hard to find an old window that had been left slightly ajar. We pried it open and crawled inside, the scent of mildew and rot hitting us as soon as we stepped into the house. It was exactly as I'd expected, dark, decaying, and filled with dust. There were old furniture pieces covered in tattered sheets, and the floorboards creaked under our feet. The house felt still, but there was an unsettling quality to it. A quietness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah and I wandered through the rooms, laughing nervously and poking fun at the old, creepy paintings that hung on the walls. But with every step we took, the house seemed to grow colder, as if the walls themselves were watching us. "Let's go upstairs," Sarah suggested after a while. "Are you serious?" I asked. "The stairs are falling apart. We could break our necks." But Sarah was already climbing up the rickety staircase, the old wood groaning under her weight. Reluctantly, I followed. The second floor was even worse than the first. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and there were broken mirrors that reflected only darkness. We walked down the hall, the only light coming from the weak beam of our flashlights. Then, something strange happened. We both stopped at the same time. There was a door at the end of the hallway, and for some reason, it caught our attention. It wasn't different from any of the other doors, but something about it felt wrong. "I don't think we should open it," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaky. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound brave. "We've come this far." But even as I said the words, I felt a sense of dread flood over me. I reached for the door handle. It was cold to the touch, and the moment I turned it, the door swung open on its own, as if something on the other side had been waiting for us. We stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, like old wood and something else, something metallic. The room was dark, and the only thing in it was a large, old-fashioned armchair in the center, facing the wall. There was no light, no furniture, just the chair. "This is creepy," Sarah whispered, stepping back. "Let's go." But I didn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the chair. There was something off about it, something wrong. The way it was positioned, facing the wall, as if it was waiting for someone to sit down. But what struck me as odd was the fact that there was dust everywhere, except for the chair. The seat was disturbingly clean. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stared at it. "I'm done," Sarah said, tugging at my sleeve. "Let's go." But before I could respond, I heard it, a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then it came again, faint, like a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah looked at me, her face pale. "We need to get out of here now," but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like something was holding me in place. And then, From the corner of my eye, I saw something shift in the chair. At first, it was just a movement, almost imperceptible. But then the figure appeared. A man. He was sitting in the chair, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know that he wasn't a real person. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were wide and hollow, staring into nothing. I gasped, and Sarah screamed, backing away from the door. But the figure didn't move. It just sat there, unmoving, as though waiting for us to leave. Who are you?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The figure's mouth opened, but it wasn't words that came out. It was a low, guttural noise, like a moan, or the sound of something trying to speak from the depths of a grave. Without thinking, I turned and ran, pulling Sarah behind me. We raced down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the car. As we drove away, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the house looming in the distance, but there was nothing, just the road behind us, disappearing into the night. When we got back to Sarah's house, we tried to tell ourselves that it was all in our heads, that the house was just a decaying old structure and the figure was nothing more than our imagination playing tricks. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I tried to forget about Hollow Hill House, but the dream started. Every night, I dreamt of that armchair, of the figure sitting there, waiting. The whispers would grow louder, and I'd feel a cold hand brush against my shoulder. It wasn't until a week later that I found out the truth. Hollow Hill House had been the site of a terrible tragedy many years ago. The previous owner, a man named Thomas Blackwood, had gone insane. His wife and child had vanished without a trace, and some said he had been responsible for their disappearance. But the house had been empty ever since, with rumors of strange occurrences surrounding it. And then, one night, I found out the real reason the chair was so clean. Thomas Blackwood's last known location had been in that room. And the whispers? They were his. The man I saw wasn't a figment of my imagination. He had been waiting for someone to listen. And now, it seemed, I was part of his story. I never intended to stay in Craven Manor. It was supposed to be a short visit, a weekend getaway with a few friends to escape the pressures of school and life. But as it often happens, things didn't go as planned. And what I encountered there, well, I still can't explain it. The story begins like any other. We were just 4 high school friends, all in our senior year, trying to do something exciting before the end of the school year. Mark had found the place on an old website, one of those obscure listings of abandoned properties for rent, and he thought it would be the perfect place for a weekend retreat. Craven Manor, located on the outskirts of town, was old, secluded, and had a history that intrigued him. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just an old mansion in the middle of nowhere, right? The mansion had a dark reputation, but nothing that really made me take it seriously. They said it had been abandoned for decades after a series of unexplained deaths, but those were just rumors. The most bizarre part was that no one could seem to agree on who had lived there last, or what had happened to the original family. But Mark, being the curious one, was determined to rent the place. So, we packed our bags and headed out to the mansion on Friday evening. The drive was long, with the road narrowing the farther we went. As we got closer, the trees began to close in, making the night feel even darker. The manor stood in the distance, looming on a hill, its silhouette stark against the fading light. When we finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. The mansion looked even more intimidating up close. It was surrounded by an iron fence, with a large gate that creaked open as we approached. The stone walls were chipped and worn, and the windows were dark, almost like eyes watching us. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I chalked it up to nerves. It wasn't like I was expecting to see anything supernatural. "Come on, it's just an old house," Mark said, grinning as he climbed out of the car. "Let's check it out." We all followed him inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't musty or moldy, like you might expect from a neglected house. It was something colder, more sterile, as if the air itself had been preserved. The floorboards creaked under our feet, and dust billowed up in the dim light as we walked through the grand foyer. The walls were lined with paintings of people I didn't recognize, their faces frozen in time. There was a large staircase at the center of the room, leading up to a second floor, but the most unnerving thing was the silence. It was absolute. "I'll take the upstairs," Mark said, "and you guys can grab the rooms down here. Let's meet up in the living room in an hour, yeah?" We agreed and split off in different directions. The room I chose was near the back of the house. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture was covered in sheets, but it had a sort of charm to it. It was quiet, and it felt detached from the rest of the world. It didn't take long before I started to feel an odd sensation, a strange pressure in the air. I dismissed it, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I lay down on the bed, but I couldn't get comfortable. There was something about the house that made my mind race. I decided to head downstairs to check on the others. When I entered the living room, Mark was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "I swear, this place is messed up," he muttered, barely looking up. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I found some weird stuff upstairs. A bunch of old papers, letters, journals. Nothing made sense." I frowned. "What kind of stuff?" "I'll show you later. It's nothing important, just..." He suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his eyes shifting to something behind me. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the wall. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Yeah," Mark replied, his face going pale. "I don't know what that was." The feeling in the house shifted then, and it felt as though the air had thickened, as if the mansion itself had come alive. We both stood there in silence for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Maybe we should stick together," I said, unsure of what to do next. Mark nodded, but before he could respond, we heard it. A soft sound, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew louder, like footsteps, followed by a soft, dragging noise. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark didn't answer. His eyes were wide, and he was already moving toward the door. The dragging noise grew louder. It was unmistakable now. Something, or someone, was moving through the house. We followed the noise cautiously, moving down the hall toward the kitchen. It seemed to be coming from the back. When we reached the doorway, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It wasn't solid, like a person. It was more like a silhouette, dark and formless, flickering in the dim light. It was as if it wasn't entirely there, as if it was both in the room and outside of it. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, the figure turned, and I saw its face, if you could call it that. It was a twisted, hollow thing, a blur of shadows and smoke. The eyes were black holes, empty and soulless. "Get out," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran back to the living room, slamming the door behind us. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We gathered our things quickly, not bothering to check on the others. But when we tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. We pulled and tugged, but the door was stuck, as if something was holding it shut. In that moment, I knew we weren't alone. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. The figure was following us. Panic set in. I glanced at Mark, and he was as terrified as I was. We ran to the back door, but it was the same, locked, as if something was keeping us inside. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the house fell silent again. The footsteps stopped, and the air seemed to clear. It took us several tries, but we finally managed to force open the back door. We didn't look back as we sprinted across the yard and into the car. When we drove away, I looked at the mansion one last time through the rearview mirror. The windows were dark, but I could swear I saw a figure standing in one of them, watching us leave. We never spoke about what happened at Craven Manor. After that night, we went our separate ways, too afraid to bring it up again. But every so often, I catch myself thinking about that shadow, the one that followed us. And every time, the question lingers, what was it? And why was it waiting for us? It was late fall when I first heard about Blackthorn Hollow. I was 17, and the world seemed so small to me back then. A little rural town where nothing ever happened. My family had just moved there from the city, and I was still trying to adjust to the quiet, slow-paced life. I missed the hustle of the city, the noise, the people, anything to break the monotony. That's when I met Eric. He was a local, just a year older than me, and instantly, he became the one person I could talk to. Eric was the kind of guy who knew everything about the town, its history, its people, even the places most people avoided. One evening, we were sitting in the back of a local diner, eating fries and sipping soda, when he brought up Blackthorn Hollow. "Ever heard of Blackthorn Hollow?" he asked casually, his eyes glinting mischievously. I frowned. "No, what is it?" Eric looked around, leaning in as though he was about to tell me some deep, dark secret. "It's a part of the woods, just outside of town. Not many people go there. The place is cursed. I wouldn't recommend it." At that, my curiosity piqued. "Cursed?" I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. Eric shrugged, giving me a knowing smile. "There's a lot of stories about it. Some people say it's haunted. Others say there's something worse. But the truth is, no one really knows. What I do know is that back in the 80s, there was a disappearance. 2 people actually." I leaned forward. "What happened?" Eric took a deep breath, like he was preparing to tell me something important. "A couple of teenagers went up there one night, just like we would if we were bored. They never came back. No bodies were ever found, no real evidence of what happened. But the stories say they saw something in the woods that night, something they weren't supposed to. After that, the place got even more strange. People say that whoever goes there never comes back the same. Some get lost, others disappear." I laughed nervously. "So, you're telling me this whole place is cursed because of one stupid thing that happened decades ago?" Eric's face turned serious, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You don't get it. It's not just about that one incident. Something in those woods doesn't want to be found." That night, I couldn't shake the thought of Blackthorn Hollow from my mind. Was it really cursed? Haunted? Or was it just a place where people got lost and their disappearances were exaggerated? The more I thought about it, the more I became determined to see the place for myself, to find out if the stories Eric had told me were true. A week later, I convinced Eric to take me there. He was hesitant at first, and I could tell he wasn't too eager to revisit the place, but after some convincing, he reluctantly agreed. We made our way to the woods just before sunset. The sun dipped below the horizon as we walked through the trees, the sky turning an eerie shade of orange. The air was cooler here, thicker with fog that seemed to swirl around our feet. There was an unsettling silence, not even the usual sounds of birds or insects. "You sure this is a good idea?" Eric asked, looking over his shoulder. "Stop being a baby," I teased, though I was starting to feel an unease creeping up my spine. Eric led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The deeper we went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like fingers, and the ground beneath our feet was soft and uneven. It felt like we were walking into another world, one where time didn't exist, where the past and present were intertwined in a way that made me feel small and insignificant. After about 20 minutes of walking, we reached what seemed like the center of the woods, a clearing where the trees parted slightly. It was here that Eric stopped and turned to face me. "All right," he said, his voice lower now. "This is the spot. You can't really feel it, but there's something about this place. The air's different here, like it's watching you." I looked around, but all I could see was the dark, empty clearing. My nerves were beginning to get the best of me, but I didn't want to seem scared in front of Eric. I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Just a spooky story, right?" Eric didn't respond. He seemed distracted, almost as though he was listening for something. I looked around, but I didn't hear anything unusual. It was just the silence, thick and heavy. Then, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, I saw a figure. Just a glimpse of it, standing still and watching us. It was tall, thin, and pale, like it was made of shadow. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively took a step back. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice a little too high-pitched. Eric's face drained of color. "Stay still," he whispered, his hand grabbing my arm. "Don't move." I froze. The figure moved again, stepping into the clearing. It wasn't a person. Not really. Its face was blurred, like it wasn't supposed to exist in this world. I could hear its footsteps now, slow, dragging across the forest floor. "Eric, what is that?" I whispered urgently. "I told you," he said in a strained voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure took another step forward. It was close now, too close. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating the air around us. And then, in a flash, it was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there in the first place. The silence returned, but this time, it was worse. The air felt colder, the darkness heavier. I could see my breath now, like the temperature had dropped in an instant. "We need to leave. Now," Eric said, pulling me back toward the trees. We didn't speak a word as we retraced our steps, moving faster now, almost running through the woods. The once quiet, empty forest now felt alive, the trees closing in around us. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, following us as we moved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing behind us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst out of the trees and into the open field near the edge of the woods. But just as I thought we were safe, I looked back toward the dark tree line. There, in the distance, I saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer, too close, standing in the same spot where we had just been, and it was smiling. The smile was not human. It was wide, stretched across its face in a grotesque, twisted grin that didn't belong in the world of the living. My blood ran cold. Without another word, Eric grabbed my arm, and we ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't say anything to each other during the drive home, but I could see the fear in Eric's eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that smile, that figure, lurking in the dark corners of my room. The image of it would not leave me. The next morning, I asked Eric if he had ever seen that thing before. He hesitated, then nodded. "That's why I never come back here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That thing, it's not just a ghost. It's something else. Something older." A week later, I did some research. The story Eric had told me wasn't a rumor. It was real. The disappearances in Blackthorn Hollow weren't isolated incidents. Over the years, people had gone missing, only to be found days later, alive but changed. And those who disappeared never remembered what happened. I haven't been back to Blackthorn Hollow since that night, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the figure, its face twisted in that grin, waiting in the shadows. And I wonder if I'll ever be free of it. It started on a rainy Wednesday evening, one of those nights when the rain taps on your windows like 1,000 tiny fingers, making everything feel just a little too quiet. I had just returned home from school, a tiring day that had left my mind wandering. My family had recently moved into an old, weathered house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was a place to call our own after years of moving from apartment to apartment. There was something about the house that unsettled me. It wasn't the size or the creaky floorboards. It was something in the air, something unspoken. The house was quiet, too quiet, and it always felt like someone was watching you. But what really bothered me the most was the old mirror in the hallway. It wasn't particularly fancy. In fact, it was the kind of mirror that you'd find at a thrift store. Tarnished silver frame, scuffed edges, and a glass surface that reflected the world in a distorted way. The moment we moved in, my mom had insisted on hanging it up in the hallway. I didn't like it. It gave off an eerie feeling, almost like it wasn't just a mirror. It was a window to something else. The first time I noticed something strange was the night of the storm. I had just gotten back to my room after dinner when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the reflection didn't seem quite right. It wasn't the way I looked, it was the way I felt. Like something was off about me, as if I wasn't the one standing there at all. It was just a flicker, but I was so unsettled that I quickly turned away. I blamed the dim light, the heavy rain outside. But over the next few days, it happened again. Every time I passed the mirror, Something felt wrong. I'd see myself, but then, in the corner of my vision, I'd notice something moving, something shifting behind me in the reflection, something I couldn't explain. It was always too quick to focus on, and when I turned around, nothing would be there. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences escalated. One evening, I decided to confront the mirror. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was tired of being scared. I was determined to prove that nothing was wrong. I stood in front of the mirror for what felt like an eternity, my reflection staring back at me, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure appeared behind me in the reflection, tall, thin, and shadowy, its features obscured by the dark corners of the glass. I froze. It wasn't a trick of the light. I could see it clearly now, standing just out of view in the mirror, like it was waiting for something. I didn't dare to turn around. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away from the mirror, my feet stumbling over the floorboards. But just before I could leave the hallway, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't my reflection anymore. The person in the mirror was someone else. A man, dressed in a tattered coat, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just stared. I ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, my breath coming in quick gasps. I rushed to my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, shaking. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But there was no explanation. There was only fear. The next morning, I tried to act normal. I told myself it was a bad dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the mirror was still there, lurking just behind the glass, waiting for me to look again. I avoided the hallway after that. I made sure to walk around the mirror whenever I passed it. I thought if I ignored it long enough, maybe it would go away. But the strange feeling never left. Days passed, and the man in the mirror didn't show up again. At least, not the way he had before. But there was something else. At night, when I lay in bed, I could hear noises coming from the hallway. Soft footsteps, the creak of floorboards. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the sounds always seemed to happen right after I turned off the lights, when everything should have been still. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hallway, the air thick with the smell of dust and old wood. My heart pounded as I reached the mirror. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the storm outside. I stared at my reflection, my fingers tightening around the flashlight, ready to face whatever might be there. And then I saw him again, the man in the mirror. But this time, he wasn't standing behind me. He was standing next to me, his face twisted in a grotesque expression, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth stretched into a slow, crooked grin that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I couldn't look away. His smile grew wider, the features on his face distorting like something unnatural. I reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, I heard a voice, soft, rasping, coming from the mirror. "You should have never looked." I froze. The voice was hollow, empty, like it didn't belong in the world. And then, the man in the mirror reached out. His fingers stretched towards me, moving unnaturally slow, as if the glass were no longer solid. I felt a cold rush of air, like something had passed through me. I turned and ran without looking back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My feet slipped on the wooden floor, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I slammed the door to my room shut and locked it behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his unblinking eyes staring at me, his smile widening. It was as if he was still there, in the darkness, waiting for me to turn around and face him again. The next morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I went downstairs and found my mom in the kitchen. I didn't know how to tell her what was going on. I didn't know if I even believed it myself, but I couldn't ignore it. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking, "there's something wrong with the mirror in the hallway. I don't know how to explain it, but it's not just a reflection. There's something in it. Something that's not real." My mom looked at me, her face unreadable. "It's just an old mirror, honey. It's probably just your imagination, but I could see it in her eyes. There was something there, something she wasn't telling me. That night, after my mom had gone to bed, I decided to confront the mirror one last time. I needed to know the truth. Was I just losing my mind? Or was something really there? I walked into the hallway, the mirror hanging in front of me like a silent witness to whatever was about to happen. I took a deep breath and stared into it, waiting for the reflection to change. Nothing happened at first, just my face staring back at me, my eyes wide with fear. But then, in the corner of the glass, I saw him again. The man. His face was closer this time, his eyes hollow and dark. He was standing right next to me in the reflection, but when I looked to the side, there was nothing there. His smile stretched even wider, too wide, until his face was just a grotesque mask of darkness. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, his hand reached out from the glass. I don't remember what happened next. I just remember waking up in my bed the next morning, the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The house was still, silent, but when I looked around, I realized something had changed. The mirror was gone. I never saw it again. My mom said she had taken it down, but I didn't believe her. I knew what I had seen, and to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't looked into that mirror. If I hadn't stared into the eyes of whatever it was that lived there, waiting. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can almost hear the faint whisper of that voice again, soft and rasping, from somewhere deep within the dark corners of my memory, and I wonder if it's still watching me. It was an ordinary Friday evening when everything changed. I was a senior in high school, living in a small, quiet town tucked away in the valley. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. But that Friday night, everything would be different. It started with a phone call from my best friend, Kelly. She was frantic on the other end of the line. Her voice trembled as she told me about something that had happened earlier that day. You have to hear this, Kelly said, barely able to catch her breath. Eliza Grace is missing. Eliza Grace. The name sent a chill through me. She was a quiet girl, a senior at our school, who always seemed to keep to herself. She had a mysterious air about her, often seen walking alone along the edge of town, her dark hair flowing like a shadow behind her. Some of the other kids said she was weird, but I never thought much of it. She wasn't the kind of girl you'd expect to disappear. What do you mean she's missing? I asked, my voice low with concern. Kelly paused. The silence on the other end of the line was almost deafening. She went to the woods earlier this afternoon. She said she was just going for a walk, but she never came back. And now no one can find her. I felt my stomach tighten. The woods. Everyone in town knew about the woods. They were dark and dense, full of twisting paths and old, forgotten trails. The kind of place that felt like it was hiding something, but no one ever really dared to talk about it. There were stories, of course, stories about people who'd wandered in and never come out. Stories about strange sounds, unexplainable events, and things moving in the shadows. But those were just rumors, right? Nothing more than tall tales told to scare kids. But now, Eliza Grace was missing, and it seemed like no one had any answers. My mind raced with questions. Why would she go into the woods alone? Had something happened to her? And why wasn't anyone talking about what had happened? I'm going to look for her, I told Kelly, my voice filled with determination. Where exactly did she go? I don't know, Kelly said, her voice breaking, but I heard she was near the old cabin at the edge of the woods. The one that's been abandoned for years. The old cabin. That place was notorious in our town, a relic from a bygone era, overgrown with vines and hidden in the heart of the woods. I'd heard stories about the cabin, stories about people disappearing near it, about strange happenings that no one could explain. The last time I had been out there, I'd gotten a bad feeling, like something was wrong, but I never thought much of it. Now, my heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't sit around waiting. Eliza Grace had gone missing, and I had to do something. I'll go there now, I said, determination in my voice. Stay here and call the cops, okay? I'll check the woods and see if I can find anything. I'm coming with you, Kelly replied immediately. You shouldn't go alone. I hesitated, then agreed. Kelly and I had been through a lot together. I knew I could trust her. We quickly made plans to meet at the edge of the woods, not far from the old cabin. It wasn't far, but the thought of going into those woods, especially with the sun starting to set, made my skin crawl. As I made my way to the meeting point, the air grew colder. The clouds above were thick and heavy, casting a dark shadow over the town. My mind raced with thoughts of Eliza. What could have happened to her? What was in those woods that could make someone disappear without a trace? When Kelly arrived, we didn't waste any time. We grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods. The familiar sounds of the town faded away behind us, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, our footsteps echoing in the stillness, the dark trees closing in around us. The further we ventured, the more the air seemed to grow thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The night was closing in fast, and the sun had long since disappeared beyond the horizon. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw it. The cabin. The weathered, rotting structure stood at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by twisted trees and vines that seemed to crawl up the walls. It looked abandoned, as it had for years, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "That's it," Kelly whispered, her voice shaky. This is where she was headed. We approached the cabin cautiously, our flashlights flickering in the dark. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we stepped closer. Something didn't feel right. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, trying to ignore the fear creeping up my spine. "Eliza?" I called out softly, my voice trembling. "Eliza, are you in there?" There was no response, just the wind, rustling through the trees, and the creak of the cabin. We exchanged a nervous glance, but neither of us wanted to be the one to turn back. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The cabin was old, the air thick with dust and mildew. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the wooden floors creaked beneath our feet. But there was something more, a strange, unsettling feeling that hung in the air like a cloud. As we moved through the cabin, we saw evidence of someone having been there. Scattered belongings, overturned chairs, a torn book lying on the floor. But no Eliza. I moved toward the back of the cabin, my flashlight illuminating the dark corners. That's when I saw it. The mirror. It was a large, old-fashioned mirror, hanging on the wall in the far corner. The glass was cracked, and the frame was covered in dust. But what struck me the most was the reflection. The room behind me was dark and empty, but in the mirror, I could see something different. A figure, standing just out of sight. It wasn't Eliza. It was a man. His face was blurred, distorted, but his presence was undeniable. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but the room was still empty. The man was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked Kelly, my voice shaking. Kelly looked at me, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" "The mirror," I whispered, my breath caught in my throat. There was someone in it. A man. She looked at the mirror, but it was empty now. The reflection was just of the dusty room, the same as before. "You're just seeing things," she said, trying to reassure me. "It's just an old mirror." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned away from the mirror and headed back toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. I had to get out of there. But as I reached the door, something caught my eye. A scrap of paper, half buried under a pile of debris. I bent down to pick it up, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, written in a hurried scrawl. "Don't go into the woods. They're watching. They'll find you. The man in the mirror is waiting." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't a coincidence. Eliza had been here, and whatever was happening, whatever had taken her, it was tied to this cabin, to the mirror, to the woods themselves. We ran out of the cabin, the note clenched in my hand. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods, where we finally found our way back to town. But as we looked back, the lights from the cabin were still visible, flickering in the distance like they were calling us. The police found Eliza's body the next day, just outside the cabin. She had been disoriented, confused, as if she had been lost for days. There were no signs of violence, no marks on her body, but her eyes were wide with fear, staring at nothing, as if she had seen something she couldn't explain. I never went back to the woods again. I couldn't, but I still hear the whispers sometimes. The voice calling from the mirror, warning me to stay away. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder what Eliza saw in that cabin, and whether the man in the mirror is still waiting, watching, for the next person who dares to venture into the woods. The thing is, no one ever really leaves the woods. It's strange how something that starts so small can grow into a fear that consumes you. That's what happened to me, and it all began with an old house I had never noticed before, even though I had driven by it 100 times. It was one of those houses that seemed to blend into the background, a faded, weather-worn structure at the end of a quiet street on the edge of town. No one lived there anymore. At least, that's what I thought. It had been vacant for years, but every time I passed, I felt a strange pull, like something was calling me to stop and look. I'm Sarah, and I've lived in this town my whole life. Growing up, you learn the layout of your surroundings, the places to go and the places to avoid. But that house had always been there, on the corner, looking like it belonged to another time, another world. As a kid, I was told not to go near it, like it was some kind of forbidden place. It was an old Victorian house, tall and looming, with a large front porch and broken windows. But despite its state of decay, something about it felt alive. It wasn't until last year, after I moved back into town for college, that I noticed it again. I was living with my older brother, Mark, in a small apartment nearby. One afternoon, I had been driving back from campus when I noticed the house once more, just sitting there at the end of the street, as if it had always been waiting. That same strange feeling washed over me, and without thinking, I pulled over and parked. I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My brother had mentioned the house in passing a few times, telling me how weird it was that it never seemed to change, like time had frozen around it. He said that no one had lived there for years, but even so, the windows always seemed to glimmer with some strange light at night. He never really went into detail, but I could tell something about it bothered him too. So, on that afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the house, staring up at it. The peeling paint, the overgrown ivy crawling up the sides, the way the front gate creaked in the wind. It all made me uneasy. But there was something else. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something in my gut told me there was more to this place than met the eye. I didn't dare go inside, but I did what any curious person would do. I stood there for a few moments, staring at the house, trying to get a feel for it. I thought about taking pictures, but the air around the place felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be documented. After a few minutes, I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost like a voice calling my name. Sarah. I froze. My name echoed through the air, clear as day, but I was alone. I glanced over my shoulder at the house, my heart pounding. It was absurd, I told myself. The wind must have carried the sound. I turned and got back into my car quickly, my hands trembling as I started the engine. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure nothing was following me. Nothing was there, but I still felt that unsettling presence. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I had nightmares, strange dreams about being trapped inside it, wandering its dark hallways, hearing whispers from the walls. Every time I drove by, my gaze would linger on it for just a little too long. It wasn't just me. Mark started to act differently too. He'd complain about feeling watched, about hearing strange sounds at night when we were in the apartment. One evening, we sat on the couch, watching TV, when Mark spoke up. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Have you heard the stories about that house?" he asked, eyes glued to the screen. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "There's rumors, Sarah," he said. "Rumors about strange things happening there. People have disappeared." I was about to laugh it off, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. He continued, his voice tense. "Years ago, when I was a kid, I heard people talk about it. They said the house was haunted, that it wasn't just abandoned. Some people claimed it was cursed, and there was a family who lived there once, but they all vanished one night without a trace. No one ever figured out what happened to them. I had heard the rumors too, but they had always seemed like ghost stories, things kids told each other to get a rise. But hearing Mark say it out loud made something click in my mind. I remembered that strange whisper from earlier, the way the air had felt thick when I stood in front of the house. "I think we should go in," I said suddenly, surprising even myself. It was impulsive, reckless, and I knew it was a bad idea. But there was something pulling me toward that house, something I couldn't ignore. Mark's eyes widened in shock. "Are you crazy?" "No way." But I was determined. That night, after dinner, I grabbed a flashlight and told Mark I was going to check out the house. To my surprise, he didn't argue further, but he agreed to come along. Maybe it was his own curiosity, or maybe it was just a way to make sure I didn't go alone. We arrived at the house under the cover of darkness, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, and the house loomed in front of us like some ancient creature, its empty windows staring down at us. We stood there for a moment, just looking at it, both of us trying to convince ourselves we were doing the right thing. Finally, Mark sighed and moved toward the front gate, pushing it open with a loud creak. We walked toward the porch, our footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The front door was slightly ajar, just enough for us to slip inside. We hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The air inside was thick, musty, and smelled of mildew. The house was cold, even though it was a warm night outside. We flicked on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness as we explored room after room, each one more decayed than the last. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floors creaked with every step, and there was an overwhelming silence in the air. But then, we heard it, the sound of something moving in the next room. It was faint at first, like the shuffle of footsteps. I turned to Mark, but he was already looking at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Before he could answer, we heard it again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. We didn't wait. We bolted out of the room and into the hallway, our flashlights darting around. The house seemed to be getting darker, the shadows deeper, as if something was swallowing the light. "Sarah, let's go," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Now." We turned to head back to the front door, but as we reached the staircase, something stopped us in our tracks. A soft voice, just barely audible, floated down the stairs. "Help." It was faint, but it was there. Someone, or something, calling for help. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I turned to Mark, my eyes wide with terror. "Mark, what's going on?" We didn't know what to do. The voice was coming from somewhere upstairs, deep within the house, and it wasn't just any voice. It was Eliza's voice. Eliza was a local girl who went missing several years ago, one of the many mysterious disappearances tied to the house. Her case was never solved, and her name had become part of the town's dark folklore. Without thinking, we rushed up the stairs, following the sound of the voice. It led us to the master bedroom, where we found an old mirror, cracked and dusty, hanging crookedly on the wall. The voice stopped as we entered the room, and that's when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't ours. It was a figure, tall, thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, it whispered, "You should never have come here." We ran. We didn't look back. The next morning, we told the police about what we had found. They came and searched the house, but they found nothing. No trace of Eliza, no sign of anything strange. They said it was just our imagination, but I knew better. I haven't been back to that house since. The whispers still haunt me, echoing in my mind. I hear them late at night when the house is quiet, like someone's calling my name from far away. And sometimes, when I drive by, I see the lights flicker in the windows, and I know something is still watching. It was an ordinary Saturday night when everything changed for me. My name is Alex, and I've lived in a small suburban neighborhood my whole life. The kind of place where you know your neighbors by name, and the streets are always quiet, especially after the sun sets. But the night I'm about to tell you about wasn't ordinary at all. It was the night I learned that some places should never be explored. It all started when I noticed something odd while driving home from my part-time job at the local diner. I had taken the long way, cutting through Alder Street, the street I usually avoided because it was isolated and didn't have many houses. The neighborhood was nice enough, but Alder Street had an eerie feel to it, like something was always just off. The streetlights barely reached the ground, casting long, unnatural shadows on the sidewalk, and the houses were all old, dilapidated, in a way that didn't feel right. As I was driving, I noticed something new. At the far end of the street, just past the old iron fence that marked the edge of a dilapidated property, there was a house I hadn't seen before. I knew the area like the back of my hand, and yet this house had appeared out of nowhere. It was a large Victorian-style building, with a turret that reached up into the night sky, dark windows, and a yard overrun with weeds. It looked like something out of a horror movie, and my heart skipped a beat as I slowed down to get a better look. I could have sworn it wasn't there the last time I drove down this street, but there it was, in all its dark, imposing glory. The windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking any view inside, and the porch sagged, like no one had cared for it in decades. A faint, rustling sound echoed from the trees in the front yard, but I couldn't figure out if it was just the wind or something more sinister. I turned the corner and kept driving, but I couldn't stop thinking about the house. Something about it didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have known about it. It wasn't until later that night, when I was lying in bed, that the thought kept nagging at me. I needed to know more. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me, and I drove back to Alder Street. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe the house would be gone, or maybe I would get a better look at it in the daylight. But as I turned onto Alder Street again, I saw it. The house was still there. I parked my car across the street and just sat there for a few minutes, staring at it. The house looked abandoned, but it was well maintained, almost like someone had been taking care of it recently. There was no sign of life. No cars in the driveway, no people walking around the yard, just the house standing there in its eerie silence. But it didn't feel like an ordinary house. It felt like it was watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but the curiosity was too strong. I got out of the car and walked across the street toward the property. The iron fence was old, rusted, and slightly bent, but the gate wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped into the yard, the overgrown grass crunching under my feet. The house loomed above me, its dark windows reflecting the overcast sky. I walked up the creaky steps to the front door, which was slightly ajar, as though inviting me inside. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning under the pressure, and stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, like no one had lived here for years, even though everything seemed intact. The hallway stretched out before me, leading to a staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, and old family portraits hung crookedly on the walls, their eyes following me as I moved through the space. I shivered, my breath catching in my throat. There was something off about this house, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to leave. But I ignored the warning signs. I had to know. I made my way through the ground floor, room by room. The furniture was covered in sheets, as though the family had left in a hurry. There were no signs of recent life, no personal items lying around. It felt like a ghost house, frozen in time. But in one of the rooms, something caught my eye. A small table covered in dust, with a framed photograph sitting on top. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the best of me. The photo was of a woman, standing in front of the house. Her eyes were wide, her expression frozen in a half-smile. It was an old photograph, the edges yellowed with age, but what struck me the most was the date written on the back, July 18, 1957. I turned the photo over in my hands, staring at the woman's face. There was something about her that felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. She looked like someone I'd seen before, but I wasn't sure where. Just then, I heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps coming from upstairs. I froze, my blood running cold. I knew I was alone, but the noise was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. Slowly, I turned toward the staircase, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, as if someone was moving around up there, pacing back and forth. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my feet unwilling to move. The curiosity had a hold on me, and I had to know what was happening. I slowly made my way to the stairs, my hand gripping the railing as I ascended one step at a time. The footsteps stopped as I reached the top, and a cold gust of wind brushed past me. I reached the landing and looked down the narrow hallway. The doors to several rooms were closed, but there was one door at the far end of the hall that stood slightly open. It was that room that called to me. Without thinking, I walked toward it, my pulse racing. As I got closer, I could hear a faint whisper, as though someone was speaking just beyond the door. The voice was soft, barely audible, but the words were clear. "Leave now." My heart skipped a beat, and I hesitated. The voice was unmistakable. Someone was warning me, but I couldn't leave yet. I had to know what was in that room. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for an old rocking chair in the corner, its wooden frame creaking as though someone had just been sitting in it. The walls were bare, and the floorboards were covered in dust. But on the far side of the room, there was a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The mirror was old, its surface scratched and cloudy, but there was something about it that caught my attention. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, and that's when I saw it. Reflected in the mirror was the figure of the woman from the photograph. She stood behind me, her expression frozen in that same half-smile, her eyes locked onto mine. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, just like before. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned around quickly, but no one was behind me. Panic surged through me, and I backed toward the door. I had to get out of there. As I fled down the stairs, the whispering started again, louder now, echoing through the house. "Get out! You shouldn't be here." I ran through the front door and out into the yard, my heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped away, the image of the woman's face still haunting my mind. The next day, I drove back to the house. But when I reached Alder Street, I couldn't find it. The house was gone, completely vanished, like it had never been there at all. The lot was empty, just a patch of overgrown grass where the house used to stand. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know why I heard the footsteps, why I saw the woman in the mirror, or why the house had vanished without a trace. All I know is that I'll never go back to Alder Street. And every time I drive by now, I can't help but glance at the empty lot, wondering if it will ever appear again, waiting for the next curious soul to walk through its door. Some houses aren't just empty buildings. They're waiting for someone to notice them. And when you do, it's already too late. I'll never forget the summer of 2016. It started like any other, warm, lazy days filled with long afternoons spent at the lake and evenings sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea. But by the end of that summer, everything I thought I knew about my small town of Maple Ridge would be forever changed. My name's Hannah, and I grew up in Maple Ridge, a town that prides itself on being quiet and peaceful. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business, where the big news is the annual 4th of July parade, and the biggest scandal in years was when old Mrs. Lawrence's cat went missing. But that all changed one fateful night. It started with the disappearance of Sarah Foster. Sarah was my best friend. We'd known each other since we were kids, growing up on the same street, going to the same schools. We'd spent countless hours together, whether it was riding bikes down the winding roads of our neighborhood or hanging out at the local diner after school. We were inseparable. So, when she vanished, it sent shockwaves through the town. It was a warm Tuesday evening in late June when Sarah went missing. I had been with her earlier that day. We had met up after work to catch up, sitting on the old swings at the park near Maple Ridge Elementary. She was supposed to meet her boyfriend, Jake, later that evening, but I never imagined that would be the last time I'd see her. That night, Sarah didn't come home. Her parents were frantic. I knew them well. They were kind, gentle people who ran the local bookstore. They had always been there for me, and now their daughter was gone. The police were called, but after hours of searching, there was still no sign of her. They searched the entire town, going door to door, speaking to everyone who had seen Sarah that day. But the more they searched, the more it seemed like she had vanished into thin air. The police had no leads. No one had seen anything unusual. No strange cars had been spotted. It was as if Sarah had simply disappeared without a trace. I remember walking around town with my parents the next day, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on all of us. Maple Ridge wasn't the kind of town where things like this happened. People went missing in big cities, sure, but not here. Not in a place where everyone knew each other's names. But the longer Sarah was gone, the more strange things began to happen. One evening, about a week after Sarah's disappearance, I was walking home from the store when I passed by her house. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought seeing her parents would make me feel better. Or maybe I just wanted to hold on to the hope that she'd come back. But as I walked up the familiar path to her house, something felt off. The house was dark, the lights in the windows dim, even though it was only a little after 6. Her parents were usually home by now. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I tried the doorbell, waited a few moments, then knocked again. Still nothing. It was then that I noticed something strange in the front yard. Just beside the porch, under a big oak tree, was a small wooden box. I had never seen it before. It wasn't there the last time I was at the house. I approached the box, my curiosity getting the better of me. It was old, worn from years of being exposed to the elements. I knelt down to inspect it, feeling a shiver run up my spine. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. The lid was slightly open, and there was something inside, but I couldn't quite make it out in the fading light. My fingers trembled as I reached to open it. Inside, I found a collection of photographs, some of them old and others newer. They were pictures of Sarah, some of them from when we were kids, others from recent months. But there was something off about them. In each photo, there was a shadow in the background, almost like someone was watching from afar. At first, I thought it was just the lighting or a trick of the camera, but the more I looked at them, the more I realized something wasn't right. As I flipped through the photos, I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of Sarah standing in front of her house, but the shadow in the background was no longer just a shape. It was a figure, tall, with dark features that were almost indistinguishable. The figure seemed to be standing just outside the frame of the picture, lurking just out of sight, but it felt as if it was there in the moment, watching Sarah. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to show these photos to someone, but my hands shook as I carefully placed them back into the box and shut the lid. I couldn't bring myself to leave the box at Sarah's house, so I took it with me. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs, about the figure in the background, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had seen something similar before. When Sarah and I were younger, we used to go hiking through the woods behind our neighborhood. We'd always joke about the spooky parts of the woods, the places where the trees were too thick, where the air grew cold and the wind seemed to die. I remember one afternoon, when we were around 12, we found an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was small, almost hidden by the trees, and we both swore we saw someone standing in the window when we passed by. We ran out of there, laughing nervously, but the memory stayed with me. I had always wondered about that cabin, but I had never gone back to see if it was still there. But now, looking at the photos, I had an eerie feeling that there was a connection between that cabin and the figure in the photographs. It felt like Sarah had been watched for a long time, maybe even before she disappeared. The next morning, I drove to the woods behind our neighborhood. The path we had taken as kids was still there, overgrown and forgotten, but I remembered it clearly. As I walked deeper into the trees, the air grew colder, and the familiar sounds of the forest seemed to fade into an unsettling silence. When I reached the spot where the cabin used to stand, my heart skipped a beat. It was still there. The cabin, now decaying and overrun with vines, stood just as I remembered. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It looked abandoned, but there was something different about it now. I could feel the weight of it, like the air around it was thick with something dark. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, and then, as I approached the doorway, I saw it. On the floor, just inside the threshold, was a set of footprints, fresh, like someone had been there recently. They led inside, deep into the darkness of the cabin. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cabin smelled musty and damp, the floor creaking under my weight as I moved deeper. The walls were covered with old, faded drawings, some of which looked like they had been done by children. But as I moved farther into the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, on the far wall, was a drawing of Sarah. It was crude, done in charcoal, but it was unmistakably her. She was standing in front of the same house where she had disappeared. But the figure in the background was there again, more defined this time. The eyes were dark, and the figure seemed to be reaching out for her. I turned and bolted out of the cabin, my heart racing. Something was terribly wrong, and I didn't know how much more of this I could handle. But I knew one thing for certain. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. Someone, or something, had taken her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The drawings, the photographs, the footprints, they all pointed to the same thing. A presence, something watching, something waiting. And I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I might be the next one to disappear. The next morning, I gathered the courage to tell the police everything I had found. They listened, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't believe me. They said they'd check the cabin and the area around it, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. I don't know if it's too late to find Sarah. I don't know if anyone can ever find her. But one thing is clear. Maple Ridge is hiding something dark, something old, and it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. And I fear that I might already be too late. I don't remember how it all started. It's one of those stories where everything feels so surreal that it blurs into one long, haunting nightmare. But if I try to piece it together, I'll tell you this. I'll never be the same again after what happened in Wicker Hollow. It was the summer of 2018, the kind of summer that should have been filled with fun, but instead, it became a terrifying memory I can't escape. My name is Rachel, and I used to live in a small town called Brooksville. It's a quiet, rural place where everyone knows each other. The kind of town where nothing exciting ever happens. Or at least, that's what I thought, before Wicker Hollow changed everything. Wicker Hollow is a place that most people in town avoided. It's a part of Brooksville's outskirts, a stretch of land filled with thick woods and an old, decaying farm that's been abandoned for years. I'd heard stories about it as a kid, whispered tales passed down by parents to warn us away. They'd say it was cursed or haunted, that bad things happened there. But, like most kids, I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. Wicker Hollow was just a creepy place you didn't go near. That is, until one evening, when my friend Lucy dared me to visit it. Lucy and I had been inseparable for years, best friends since childhood. That summer, we were restless, bored with the usual hangouts in Brooksville. One afternoon, after a long day of exploring the fields near our town, Lucy suddenly brought up Wicker Hollow. "I dare you," she said, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "Dare me to do what?" I asked, already knowing where this was going. "To go into Wicker Hollow. We've talked about it forever. Let's just go check it out." I hesitated. I had heard all the warnings. I'd heard about the strange disappearances, the lights in the woods at night, the eerie noises that no one could explain. But I didn't want to back down. It was a dare. After all, I wasn't about to let her think I was scared. "Fine," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "But we go at night. We'll be in and out. No big deal." That night, after our parents went to bed, we snuck out of our houses and met at the edge of Wicker Hollow. The moon was full, casting long shadows over the fields. The wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. The place felt off, like the air was too thick, too heavy. Lucy handed me a flashlight and grinned. "Ready?" I nodded, though I didn't feel ready at all. But we pushed forward, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the dark as we entered the woods. The further we went, the quieter it got. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just silence, an unnatural kind of silence. We reached the old farmhouse after what felt like an eternity. It was in worse shape than I remembered. Windows shattered, the roof caving in, the wooden structure leaning at odd angles. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, but standing there in the dead of night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a decaying building. It felt alive, like it was watching us. "Let's go inside," Lucy said, her voice a little shaky now. "Come on, Rachel. You're not scared, are you? I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. No, I'm not scared. I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, Lucy or myself. We made our way inside, stepping carefully over broken glass and rotting floorboards. The air was thick with dust and mold, and the musty scent made me want to gag. The floor creaked beneath our feet, but still, there was no sound from outside. No wind, no animals, just an eerie stillness that pressed down on us. Do you hear that? Lucy asked suddenly, her eyes wide. I stopped, straining to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, I made out a soft whisper. It was coming from upstairs, barely audible but unmistakable. The whisper seemed to be saying my name. Rachel. It was almost a chant. Rachel. I froze. My blood ran cold. There was no one else here. No one but Lucy and me. But the voice, it felt real. It felt like it was right beside me. What is that? I whispered, my voice trembling. Lucy's face was pale. I don't know. Let's get out of here. But it was too late. The door behind us slammed shut, echoing through the house. We both spun around, but the door was stuck, as though something heavy was blocking it from the other side. Let us out, I screamed, banging on the door. But there was no answer. Only the soft whispering, growing louder now. Rachel. Lucy. I could feel something in the house, something watching us from the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to Lucy. We need to find another way out. We made our way through the house, searching for an open window or another exit. But the further we went, the more impossible it felt to leave. It was as if the house itself was changing, warping around us, making it harder to find a way out. The walls seemed to close in, and every time I turned a corner, I could swear the rooms had shifted. Finally, we found a stairway that led to the basement. We hesitated for a moment, but the whispering was now too loud to ignore. It was like 1,000 voices, all calling our names, urging us deeper into the house. Let's just check the basement, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucy nodded, though her face was ghostly pale. We descended into the darkness, the stairs creaking under our weight. The air grew colder, and the whispering was now accompanied by an odd, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was knocking on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering intermittently. The basement was empty, save for an old wooden crate in the corner. My breath hitched when I saw it. The crate was oddly familiar, like something I had seen before in old photographs. Do you think? Lucy started, but her voice trailed off as we both approached the crate. I opened it without thinking, the lid creaking as it lifted. Inside, there was nothing but a stack of old newspapers and what looked like pieces of cloth. But as I reached to pull them out, my hand froze. Underneath the fabric, there was something more. A photograph. A faded, black and white photo of a family, 2 parents and 2 children, standing outside the same farmhouse we were in. But it wasn't just any family. The man in the photo, the father, looked strangely familiar. It was as if I had seen him somewhere before, but I couldn't place where. I turned the photo over, and written on the back in neat, old handwriting were the words, "The Wilkins family, the last to live in Wicker Hollow." Suddenly, I remembered something. Something I had heard from an old neighbor years ago. The Wilkins family had vanished without a trace in the 1950s, leaving behind their house, their belongings, and no explanation. They had simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. No one knew what happened to them. No one ever spoke about it after that. I looked at Lucy, her face pale with fear. We need to leave. Now. But as I turned to head back up the stairs, something stopped me. The door to the basement slammed shut, locking us inside. I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the top of the stairs. The whispering was back, louder than ever, and now I could hear something else, something breathing. Deep, ragged breaths, like someone, or something, was waiting for us. I knew we weren't alone anymore. The Wilkins family had never left. They were still here, in the house, waiting for the next 2 curious souls to wander in. And now, Lucy and I were trapped in Wicker Hollow, with no way out. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, how we escaped, or what we saw in that house. I've tried to forget, tried to block it from my memory, but the whispering still haunts me. And every time I close my eyes, I see the photo of the Wilkins family, their eyes staring back at me as if to say, "You're next." It's hard to shake the feeling that something is always lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I've spent a lot of nights thinking about the disappearance of Emily Brooks, and I still can't make sense of what happened. It's been 5 years, but the memory is still so vivid in my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear her voice, just before she vanished. I never thought I'd be involved in something like this. My name is Claire, and I was Emily's best friend. We grew up together in a quiet town called Pine Ridge, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Pine Ridge was the kind of town where nothing bad ever happened. The kind of town where you could leave your doors unlocked at night and feel safe. But that all changed when Emily disappeared. Emily was the kind of person who could light up a room with just her smile. She was smart, kind, and always up for an adventure. We'd spent countless afternoons together, walking along the forest trails behind our neighborhood, talking about everything and anything. We had our whole lives ahead of us, or so we thought. That was before Emily vanished. It was a Saturday afternoon in early October when it happened. The weather had been perfect all week, crisp and cool, with a clear blue sky. Emily and I had plans to meet up at the park, like we always did, but she never showed up. I thought maybe she'd gotten caught up with something at home, so I waited, texting her a few times, but there was no reply. When I didn't hear from her by evening, I started to worry. It wasn't like Emily to leave me hanging. We had been friends for years, and she was always punctual. I called her parents, but they hadn't seen her either. Her mom mentioned that Emily had been acting a little strange in the days leading up to her disappearance, distracted, distant, but nothing too alarming. She hadn't said anything about going anywhere. That's when things started to feel off. Emily wasn't the type of person to just disappear, and her family was just as concerned as I was. The police were notified, and a search began almost immediately. The first few days were full of hope. The search parties combed the area around the park, the woods, and even the nearby creek. They knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. But as the hours turned into days, that hope slowly began to fade. There was no sign of Emily. No trace of her phone, no unusual messages, no clues to suggest where she might have gone. I'll never forget the look in her parents' eyes when the reality started to set in. They were devastated, and I was too. I couldn't understand how someone as vibrant as Emily could simply vanish. Where could she have gone? By the end of the second week, the search had slowed down. The police had no leads, and the community started to lose hope. The local news had stopped covering the story. It was like Emily had never existed. But that's when things started to get strange. A few weeks after her disappearance, I decided to go through the things Emily had left behind. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought it would help me understand what happened. It didn't make any sense, but I felt like I needed to do something. I went to her house and asked her mom if I could look through her room. She was reluctant at first, but I convinced her that maybe there was something I could find that the police had missed. She agreed, and I went inside. Her room was exactly as it had been the last time I saw it. Clothes scattered across the bed, books piled high on the desk, her favorite posters still hanging on the walls. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the room was holding its breath. I started by going through her dresser drawers, looking for anything unusual. That's when I found it. In the bottom drawer, hidden under a pile of old sweaters, was a small, worn-out notebook. It wasn't one of Emily's usual journals. This one was old, the pages yellowed and fragile. I carefully flipped it open, and that's when I saw something that sent a chill through me. The first few pages were filled with typical teenage ramblings, notes about school, friends, and random thoughts. But as I continued to read, the entries began to take a darker turn. Emily had written about strange dreams, about hearing voices at night. At first, I thought it was just the typical teenage angst, but then I read one entry that made my stomach drop. "I hear someone calling me," it said. "I can't explain it. It's like someone is whispering my name in the dark. I feel like I'm being watched. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shadow. It's always there, lurking, waiting." I don't know what it wants, but I feel like it's getting closer. I stopped reading. I couldn't process what I was seeing. What was Emily talking about? What shadow? What voices? She hadn't mentioned anything like this to me before. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Was this the reason she had disappeared? Was she running from something? I kept reading, my hands trembling. The next few entries were even more disturbing. I went to the old barn today, she wrote in one entry. I don't know why. I just felt drawn to it, like something was calling me. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stop myself. It was so quiet, and the air smelled like decay. I saw something inside. A figure. I don't know if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it was there, and it was watching me. The last entry was dated the day before Emily went missing. I can't stay here anymore, she wrote. I don't know what's happening, but I have to leave. It's too dangerous. I think I know where I have to go. It's the only way I can escape. I couldn't understand what I was reading. The Emily I knew would never talk like this. What was she talking about? What was chasing her? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. It haunted me. I kept going over and over the words in my mind. I had to find out what she meant. I had to know what was happening to her. The next day, I decided to visit the barn Emily had mentioned. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me it was important. The barn was located on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, near the old farm where no one had lived for years. It was a place we had all been told to avoid as kids, but as I stood there, looking at the dilapidated structure, I felt a strange sense of calm. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old hay and rotting wood filled my nose. I scanned the area, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were old farming tools scattered across the floor, cobwebs hanging from the rafters, but nothing that looked like it had been disturbed recently. I was about to leave when I noticed something in the corner of the barn. It was a small wooden chest, hidden beneath a pile of old straw. My heart raced as I approached it. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I had to open it. Inside the chest was an old photograph. The photo was black and white, faded with age. It showed a family, 2 parents, a young girl, and a man standing beside them. The man in the photo was staring directly at the camera, his eyes cold and unblinking. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized who he was. It was the same man from the notebook, the one Emily had mentioned, the one she thought was following her. But there was more. Beneath the photograph was something else, a letter, yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking. The letter was written in the same handwriting as Emily's journal, but this wasn't her handwriting. It was the man's. "It's time for you to join us, Emily," it said. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, everything clicked. The voices, the shadow, the strange dreams. It all made sense. Emily had been running from something. Something old, something sinister. And now, it was clear to me. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken. And whatever had taken her wasn't done yet. I will never forget that night. The night that everything changed. It started like any other evening. But by the time the morning light crept through the windows, everything I knew had been turned upside down. I'm Ryan, and I've lived in Lakewood all my life. It's a small town, nestled between rolling hills and a dark, winding forest. Lakewood is peaceful, calm. Nothing ever really happens here. I grew up in the house my parents built, and most of my life was spent hanging out with friends, working at the local diner, and occasionally driving out to the lake for some quiet time. Life was simple, and I thought it would stay that way forever. That is, until I heard the first rumors about Lakewood Manor. Lakewood Manor wasn't the grand estate it once was. It had been a majestic, sprawling mansion built at the turn of the century, but over the years it fell into disrepair. Now, it was a crumbling shell of what it used to be. Everyone in town had their stories about it. Stories of its former residents, the Muir family. According to the old-timers, the Muirs had been the picture of wealth and success, but tragedy struck when their son, Samuel, vanished without a trace one night. Some said he had run away, others believed he had been taken, but no one could explain how or why. The Muirs disappeared shortly after, and the mansion was abandoned. As kids, we dared each other to go inside the mansion, but no one ever actually did. It was just too creepy. The windows were all boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, and the dark, looming silhouette of the house always seemed to cast an eerie shadow over the town. I'd heard about it so many times, but I never really thought much of it. That was until one evening, when my best friend, Tom, brought it up. "You know, I heard the old Muir Mansion's for sale," he said one night at the diner. "You think anyone's actually going to buy it?" I laughed. "Who'd want that old thing? I bet it's haunted." Tom leaned in, his voice dropping lower. I heard something different. "My uncle works for the real estate agent handling the sale. They say they're planning to renovate it. There's still stuff inside. Old furniture, things from when the Muirs lived there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You don't think they'd be foolish enough to actually fix it up, do you?" "The house is cursed." Tom smirked. "Cursed? Come on, it's just an old house. The stories are just that, stories. What's the worst that could happen?" I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept into my gut. The Muir Mansion had always been the source of local legends, but what if there was more to it? What if the stories weren't just stories? I shrugged off the thought, deciding not to dwell on it. But deep down, I knew something about it was wrong. Something about that house wasn't right. Days later, Tom came to me with a challenge. "I dare you to go inside the Muir Mansion with me," he said, his grin spreading wide. "Let's go see what's left inside. We'll be in and out before anyone notices." I knew what he was doing. He was trying to get me to back out, but I wasn't going to let him think I was scared. "Fine," I said, "but we go in and leave right away. No stupid dares or messing around." We met up after dark, knowing that no one would be watching. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees as we made our way to the manor. The mansion loomed ahead, its broken windows staring at us like dark, hollow eyes. The entire place seemed to exude an oppressive atmosphere, as if it were alive, watching us. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I pushed it aside. It was just an old house, right? There was no reason to be afraid. We climbed over the rusted gate and approached the side door, which had been left ajar. The wood creaked as we pushed it open, and the smell of mildew and decay hit us immediately. The interior was dim, with only a few slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog. We stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The hallway stretched out before us, its once grand wallpaper now peeling and faded. The walls were lined with portraits of the Muir family, their faces staring down at us with hollow eyes. There was something unsettling about them, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "Let's find the old furniture," Tom whispered, his voice echoing in the silence. We wandered through the house, moving through darkened rooms and long hallways. It felt as though the house was swallowing us whole, its oppressive presence weighing down on us with every step. The deeper we went, the more I began to feel like we weren't alone. In one of the rooms, we found an old dresser and a broken mirror. I stared at my reflection, my face pale and ghostly in the dim light. But as I looked closer, something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the reflection, was a shadow, a tall figure standing motionless in the doorway. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Tom. He didn't seem to notice. "What? You're just freaking yourself out. It's just an old house. Nothing to be scared of." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the more I looked around, the more I saw small, fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows. I heard whispers, barely audible, coming from the walls. "Let's go," I said urgently. "I don't like this." But just as we turned to leave, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. We both jumped, our hearts racing. It sounded like something, or someone, had knocked over a piece of furniture. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice shaky now. We stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed. The only sound was the distant creaking of the old house, as if it were shifting in place. But then, we heard something else, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion. Tom's face went pale. "We need to get out of here. Now." We turned and sprinted toward the door, but as we reached the hallway, we stopped dead in our tracks. Standing in front of us was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I felt my blood run cold as I stared at him, unable to move. My legs were frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure took a step forward, and the house seemed to groan in response. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine, and for a moment, everything went silent. I couldn't hear my own breath, couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my heart. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure was gone. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the hallway was empty. The house was still, eerily so. We didn't waste any time. We ran for the door, slamming it shut behind us as we bolted into the night. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we stumbled away from the mansion, never looking back. We didn't speak much after that. The experience had shaken us both to our core. I couldn't understand what had happened. Who was that man? Why had he been in the house? And what did he want? It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. The man we had seen in the hallway wasn't just any ghost or figment of our imagination. He was the last member of the Muir family, Samuel Muir, the boy who had disappeared years ago. It turned out Samuel hadn't run away as everyone thought. He had been taken by the very house that still stood in Lakewood. The mansion was cursed, its dark history tied to the Muir family's bloodline. And now it was clear. Samuel was still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross his path. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, or the chill that ran down my spine when I saw him. Lakewood Manor was never just a house. It was a prison, and whoever entered never truly left. I haven't been back to the mansion since that night, and I never will, because I know that some things are better left in the dark, forgotten, and untouched. And Lakewood Manor? It's a place that should never be visited again. It all started the night my cousin, Sarah, went missing. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We were just a group of teenagers, having fun in the woods behind our town, playing games like we had done 100 times before. But that night, something changed. Something in the air was different, like the world itself was holding its breath. My name is Jack, and I've lived in Hollow Creek my whole life. It's a small town nestled in the shadow of the thick, dark woods that stretch out for miles. There's a lot of history around here, and some of it isn't pretty. Hollow Creek isn't known for much except its eerie forests and a few local legends. Legends of strange happenings, disappearances, and mysterious figures that still lurk in the trees. But most people write it off as just stories. My friends and I, we didn't believe any of it. Until that night, we were all gathered at the usual spot, a clearing near the edge of the woods where we would hang out, tell stories, and occasionally dare each other to do something stupid. Sarah, my older cousin, was there, along with my friends, Matt and Julie. It was an ordinary night at first, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But that night, there was an unsettling quietness about everything. Like the woods themselves were holding secrets they weren't ready to reveal. "Let's go to the old cabin," Sarah suggested, her voice carrying a hint of mischief. The cabin she was referring to was an abandoned shack deep in the woods. It had been there for as long as any of us could remember, but no one ever went near it. People said it was cursed, that strange things had happened there, things no one wanted to talk about. It was the kind of place where bad things were said to happen. But we were teenagers, invincible and curious, and the idea of venturing into the forbidden cabin was too tempting to resist. "I don't know, Sarah," I said, hesitating. "I've heard stories about that place. It's not exactly a good idea." "Oh, come on," she said, grinning. "It's just a cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" Matt and Julie exchanged nervous glances, but followed her lead. I wasn't sure what exactly convinced me to go. Maybe it was the thought of not being left behind, or maybe I just wanted to prove that I wasn't scared. Whatever the reason, I found myself walking through the trees with my friends, following Sarah as she led the way. The deeper we went into the forest, the darker it became. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting into strange shapes above us, blocking out most of the moonlight. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but the closer we got to the cabin, the more uneasy I became. When we finally reached the cabin, it looked just as I had imagined. A decaying, wooden structure with a collapsed roof and broken windows. It was a shadow of its former self, the wood warped and twisted with age. There was a sense of abandonment, as if the place had been left to rot for decades. I stood at the threshold, staring at the dark interior, and a feeling of dread washed over me. Something about it felt wrong. "Let's go inside," Sarah said, her voice filled with excitement. I wanted to protest, but my friends were already stepping through the doorway. Against my better judgment, I followed them inside. The cabin smelled of damp wood and mold. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we moved through the dark, cluttered space. Old furniture sat in broken heaps, covered in layers of dust. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and in the corner of the room stood an old fireplace, now nothing more than a blackened stone pit. The air inside felt cold, despite the warm summer night outside. As we moved further into the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the walls. They were crude, hastily scratched into the wood, and they seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I didn't know much about occult symbols, but I had seen enough horror movies to recognize that these weren't just random carvings. They looked like something out of a nightmare. "I don't like this," I muttered under my breath. "We should leave." Sarah laughed and waved me off. "Stop being such a baby. It's just an old cabin. Relax." But I couldn't. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. Something was wrong with this place, and I knew it. My gut told me that whatever had happened here, whatever dark force had once resided in this cabin, was still lingering in the air. Suddenly, we heard something. A soft sound, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, distant and low, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. The voice was faint, as though it were coming from deep within the walls of the cabin. I glanced at my friends, and I saw that they had heard it too. Sarah's face had gone pale, and even Matt and Julie looked uneasy. "What was that?" Matt whispered. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "but I think it came from downstairs." I felt a chill run down my spine. The cabin had a basement, a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the depths. We hadn't planned on going down there, but now, for some reason, I felt drawn to it. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. "We should leave," I said again, my voice cracking. "We shouldn't be here." But Sarah ignored me and started heading toward the stairs. "Come on," she urged. "Let's see what's down there." "It's probably nothing." The others followed her, and I had no choice but to tag along, though every instinct inside me screamed to turn and run. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into the basement. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. When we reached the bottom, the basement was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and there was no sign of where the voice had come from. But then, as Sarah fumbled for a flashlight in her bag, the beam of light cut through the darkness, and that's when we saw it. On the far wall of the basement, there was a door. It was old, rusted shut, but the symbol that was carved into it was unmistakable. The same symbol we had seen on the walls upstairs. And in front of the door, there was something else, something I couldn't quite comprehend. It was a body. Lying on the floor was a man, his face twisted in agony. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his eyes wide open in a silent scream. His mouth was filled with blood, and his hands were bound. But the most disturbing part was the pale, grayish color of his skin. He looked like he had been dead for weeks, maybe longer. Who is that?" Julie gasped, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. The voice we had heard? It wasn't a ghost. It was a warning. Before we could react, the door suddenly creaked open, as though it were being pulled from the other side. A cold gust of air blew through the basement, and the voice returned, this time louder and clearer. Get out. I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, not looking back. We scrambled up the stairs, desperate to escape the cabin's suffocating grip. But as we reached the door, I felt something brush against my arm. Something cold, something unseen. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't want to find out. We didn't stop running until we were safely back in the clearing, panting and terrified. The night air felt warm against my skin, but it couldn't erase the cold feeling that lingered inside me. We never spoke of that night again. The next day, Sarah was gone. Her parents said she had run away, but I knew better. She hadn't just left. Something had taken her. I don't know what it was that haunted that cabin, but I know it wasn't just a ghost. It was something far older, something darker. And it's still out there, waiting, watching. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you that I didn't believe in ghosts. I would have laughed at the idea of haunted places, dismissed any talk of spirits with a wave of my hand. But then everything changed. Everything I thought I knew about the world, about the unexplained, was shattered when I stepped foot into Roswell Asylum. I'm Mark, and I grew up in a small town just outside of a larger city. Life there was calm, peaceful, even. The biggest excitement we had was when the local high school football team won a game or when the bakery had a special on donuts. But there was always one place that loomed over our town, a place that everyone whispered about but never really talked about in public. Roswell Asylum. Roswell had been built in the early 1900s, originally designed to treat those suffering from mental illness. Over the decades, however, it became infamous for its mistreatment of patients. The building, a massive structure of crumbling stone and dark windows, stood like a forgotten relic on the edge of town. It was abandoned for years, and the rumors about what went on there became even darker. Some said the patients were tortured, locked away for their entire lives without care or compassion. Others spoke of strange experiments carried out by doctors who were more interested in their own twisted research than the well-being of their patients. And then there were the stories about the spirits of patients who had died within those cold, sterile walls, who now roamed the asylum seeking revenge. It wasn't until last fall that I finally went inside. My friends and I had heard the rumors about people sneaking in to explore the asylum, about strange noises and unsettling sights. Most of the time, people came back with little to show for their bravery other than a few shaky camera shots or terrifying stories. But there was one thing that caught my attention. No one who had gone inside had ever returned with the same sense of peace. It was a Friday night when we decided to go. I was with my best friend, Ben, and a few other guys from school. There was a certain thrill in the air, the kind of adrenaline rush you get when you're about to do something reckless. The idea of stepping into a haunted building seemed like the perfect way to prove we were brave, maybe even invincible. The drive to the asylum was filled with excited chatter and nervous laughs, but as we approached, all that changed. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. The asylum's silhouette stood against the darkening sky, its crumbling walls casting long shadows across the ground. Even from the outside, the place was unnerving. I could feel the weight of its history pressing down on me, the stories of suffering and pain hanging in the air like a thick fog. Are we really doing this? Ben asked, his voice nervous, though he tried to mask it with a chuckle. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to second-guess our decision. Still, I pushed the thought away. We've come this far. Might as well go through with it. We parked the car a little distance away, trying to stay hidden from any possible security. The main entrance was blocked off, but we found a small hole in the back fence where the metal had rusted away. We squeezed through and made our way to the back of the building, the once grand doors now completely warped and broken. The air around the asylum was thick and stale, and it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling that seemed to emanate from the building. Ben led the way, the flashlight cutting through the darkness in front of him. We stepped cautiously into the asylum, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The interior was just as bad as I had imagined. Broken windows, cracked tiles, and walls that were covered in peeling paint and grime. The air was damp, and I could feel the chill on the back of my neck. I glanced around, half expecting to see a figure watching us from the shadows. "Let's stick together," I said, my voice trembling slightly. We didn't know what we'd find inside, but I was starting to get the sense that this was a bad idea. The hallway stretched out in front of us, lined with doors that were all closed, some of them hanging off their hinges. We cautiously made our way down the hall, the only sound being our soft breathing and the occasional creak of the old building. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could feel a sense of dread creeping in, like we weren't supposed to be here, like the asylum was alive, watching us, waiting for something. It wasn't until we reached the old patient wing that the first strange thing happened. We heard it, a soft, barely audible sound, like a whisper coming from one of the rooms. We froze, listening. It was almost as if someone was calling for help, but the voice was faint, muffled by the distance. "What was that?" Ben whispered, his face pale. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just keep moving." But we couldn't. There was something about the sound that pulled us in. We had to know what it was. The others were hesitant, but we managed to push open the door where the sound had come from. The room inside was dark, the air heavy with dust and decay. I could barely make out the shapes of old hospital beds, their metal frames twisted and rusted, the sheets long gone and replaced by layers of grime. And then we saw it. In the far corner of the room was an old chair, but it wasn't the chair that made my heart stop. It was the figure sitting in it. A woman, her hair long and unkempt, her face pale and gaunt. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge our presence. Her eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I felt a chill run through my body. This wasn't right. "Is she?" Ben started, but his voice trailed off. Before we could react, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending us all into a panic. We spun around, trying to find an escape, but the room was locked tight. The air became colder, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. I could see my breath in the air, swirling around me like fog. That's when the whispers started again, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, all crying out for help, all echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, the desperation in their words. "Help us. Get out. Get out now." I reached for the door, my hands trembling, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around, panicking, my mind racing. The woman in the chair remained motionless, her eyes still locked on nothing, her smile stretching wider and wider, as though it was becoming impossible for her to stop. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from across the room. One of the old metal beds had moved on its own, scraping across the floor with a sickening screech. I turned to look, but all I could see was darkness. "We have to get out," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Now." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door clicked open. We rushed out, stumbling into the hallway, our hearts pounding. The whispers followed us, echoing down the hall as though they were right behind us, but we didn't stop to look back. We didn't speak much as we ran out of the asylum, back through the hole in the fence, and into the safety of the night. We didn't stop until we were back at the car, breathing hard, our faces pale and covered in cold sweat. That was the last time any of us ever went near Roswell Asylum. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. My skin felt crawled upon, like invisible fingers were brushing against me at all times. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. The asylum was not just a building. It was a place where terrible things had happened. A place where the souls of the forgotten were trapped, and some of them didn't want to let go. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, but something had changed. I could hear whispers when I was alone, and sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could still see that woman in the chair, her smile stretched wide, her hollow eyes watching me. And to this day, I know one thing for certain. Some places are cursed, and once you step into them, they never truly let you go. It was a regular Thursday evening, the kind of night where nothing extraordinary ever seems to happen. My name is Alex, and I live in a small suburban town that prides itself on being peaceful and quiet. Nothing much happens around here, which is how most people like it. I had grown up here and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But everything changed when Emma Lane disappeared. I had known Emma for years. We weren't the closest friends, but we shared a lot of classes together, and we would always chat between periods. Emma was the type of person who could light up a room. She had a smile that made you feel like everything was going to be okay, even when life felt difficult. But in the spring of our senior year, that smile disappeared. Emma started acting differently, quiet, withdrawn. She would stop coming to school for days at a time, and when she did show up, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. At first, I assumed it was just stress. Senior year can be overwhelming, and I figured she just needed a little time to unwind. But something told me there was more to it than that. One afternoon, about a week before she disappeared, I was at the local coffee shop after school when I saw Emma sitting by herself at the back table. Her face was pale, and her eyes were sunken, like she hadn't had a good night's sleep in forever. She was staring at something in front of her, but it wasn't a phone or a book. It was a piece of paper. I walked over to her, trying to seem casual. "Hey, Emma, you okay?" She looked up at me, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Anxiety? I wasn't sure. She quickly folded the piece of paper and shoved it into her bag. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, her voice distant. "Just a lot on my mind." I didn't push her any further. I could tell she didn't want to talk, and honestly, I didn't know what to say anyway. Emma had always been open with me in the past, but now she seemed like a stranger. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about that piece of paper she had hidden away. What had she been looking at? Why had she seemed so scared? I didn't want to invade her privacy, but I couldn't help it. I had to know. The next day, I decided to check her social media. Emma's accounts were always active, and she would post photos almost every day. But when I logged in, everything was gone. Her Facebook, Instagram, even her Twitter. All of her posts were deleted. It was like she had vanished off the face of the internet. I tried texting her a few times, but she never replied. Days passed, and I began to grow increasingly concerned. I heard rumors around school that Emma had dropped out and was leaving town, but no one could confirm it. Her parents weren't saying anything, and no one had seen her for days. Then, a week later, she disappeared for good. It was a Sunday afternoon when I got the call. It was from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, I heard a voice I didn't immediately recognize. "Alice, it's Detective Thompson from the police department," the voice said. "I need to ask you a few questions about Emma Lane." My heart skipped a beat. "What happened to Emma? Is she okay?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "We don't know yet. That's why I need your help." The detective asked me questions about Emma's recent behavior, about anything unusual she had mentioned or anything that stood out to me. I told him everything I knew, about the piece of paper at the coffee shop, about the social media accounts, about her strange behavior. When I finished speaking, there was a silence on the other end of the line. "We've found Emma's car," Detective Thompson said, his voice grim. "It's parked near the woods on the edge of town. The keys were inside, but there was no sign of her. It's like she just vanished." I felt a lump form in my throat. Emma had always been careful, always responsible. She wouldn't have just disappeared without telling anyone where she was going. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with whatever she had been hiding. I agreed to meet with the detective later that evening, and when I arrived at the police station, I was led into a small, dimly lit room. The detective sat across from me, his eyes tired and full of concern. He had a stack of papers in front of him, but I could see that he wasn't really looking at them. He was thinking, analyzing, trying to put the pieces together. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked, sliding a piece of paper across the table to me. It was the same piece of paper Emma had been looking at in the coffee shop. I stared at it. It was a simple map, drawn by hand, showing the location of the woods where her car had been found. There were several markings along the path, and at the end, there was an X. It was a location, Emma's last destination. I felt a cold shiver run through me as I recognized the location. It was an old, abandoned house in the woods that no one had visited in years. I had heard stories about it when I was younger, stories about a family that had lived there, a family that disappeared under mysterious circumstances. People said it was cursed, that the house was haunted. I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but after seeing Emma's map, I started to wonder. The detective saw the recognition in my face. "Do you know this place?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's the old Wright house. People say it's haunted. There were rumors about the family that used to live there. They disappeared years ago, and the house was left empty." The detective scribbled something down in his notebook. "We're going to head out there, but I need to know. Did Emma ever mention anything about the Wright house?" I thought back to the last time I spoke to Emma, to the look on her face when I saw her in the coffee shop. She had been scared, and for some reason, the thought of the Wright house seemed to terrify her. Could it be possible that she had been drawn there? That she had gone to investigate something she shouldn't have? "I'm not sure," I said, my voice shaking. But she looked scared, and she was acting weird, like she was hiding something. The detective nodded. "I think we might be onto something, but we'll need to investigate the house." That night, the detective and a team of officers went out to the Wright house. But when they arrived, the place was completely empty. There was no sign of Emma, no footprints, no evidence she had ever been there at all. It was like the house had swallowed her up. In the weeks that followed, there were more searches, more investigations, but they turned up nothing. Emma's disappearance remained a mystery, and the case went cold. Her parents held out hope that she would come back, but as the months passed, it seemed less and less likely. The police had no leads, and no one could explain what had happened to her. Then, just when we thought the case would be forgotten, something strange happened. I was walking home from school one afternoon when I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was Emma's face, her smiling face, on a missing persons flyer tacked to a telephone pole. But it wasn't the flyer that caught my attention. It was the strange message written in red marker at the bottom of the page. "She knows what happened to the Wrights. She'll never leave." I stared at it, my heart pounding. What did it mean? What had Emma uncovered before she disappeared? And why did the message sound so final? That night, I went back to the Wright house alone. I didn't tell anyone, not even the police. I had to know the truth. I needed to understand why Emma had gone there, why she had been drawn to that cursed place. When I entered the house, the air was thick with dust, the walls dark and decayed. I moved cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I walked through the rooms, each one eerily quiet, until I reached the basement door. It was ajar. My heart raced as I stepped down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the bottom, I felt the air grow colder. And there, in the corner of the basement, was something I will never forget. Emma's bag. It was lying on the floor, just like she had dropped it. But beside it, there was a book, an old, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, and inside, I found what Emma had been looking for. The story of the Wright family, their disappearance, their strange connection to the land, and the dark secret that had haunted their family for generations. And there, in the final pages, was the chilling revelation that Emma had uncovered before she vanished. The house calls to those who are curious, but once you enter, you will never leave. I knew then, deep down, that Emma wasn't coming back. She had uncovered something that the house, and whatever force resided there, had claimed her for. And I was next. If